Today we're going to be building our own project management tool just like Trello without writing a single line of code using a tool called Bubble. Before I say another word though, let's dive in and take a quick look at what we're going to be building today. Over in the homepage of my Trello board, the first thing you'll notice is a list of all of my existing Trello boards that I've created within my own account, as well as if I scroll on down, a list of all of the Trello boards that I'm a guest member of. And on my homepage, I also have the ability to create a brand new Trello board, which throughout that process, I can upload a custom background image and give that board a title. But what I'm interested in showing you is an existing board that I've already created. So if I open up my product roadmap here, it's going to redirect me through to my dedicated board page where you'll see a series of all my lists as well as all my tasks inside of those lists. And of course, like any real world Trello board, I have the ability to add new lists. So if I wanted to add a list called archived, I could choose to add this, and it's then going to add that within my overall board. And of course, within my overall list, I can also add tasks. So I'm just going to say this is a test task. I can choose to create that. And as you'll see within some of my existing tasks, you also have the ability to upload a custom background image. So if I was to click on this task, I can see that I've given this a title. I haven't yet given it a description. So if I wanted, I could select here and just type in some text. I could say this is a test description. I could choose to save this, and I can do the exact same thing for my title. I also have the ability to change the attached cover image. And if I really wanted, I could scroll on down and even add a comment to this task. So I could say something like, this is a great idea. I could choose to save that comment, and that will appear at the bottom of my task. And what's cool about my Trello clone is that, of course, it functions just like the real world Trello product. So if I wanted to drag and rearrange the order of my lists, I can easily do that. And of course, if I want to move my tasks between lists, I also have the ability to do that. And finally, if I also wanted to invite members to my Trello board, I have the ability to open up my share menu here. I can see a list of all of my existing members in this board, but I can also search for additional members and I can send them an invite. From which, if I jump over into their email account, you'll be able to see that they've received an invitation, and that'll include a link to access that board. If you've ever tried to build your own app or startup, you'll know firsthand how complicated it can be to bring your vision to life. And well, if you're tired of sucking up to software developers, just like I was, it's time to take matters into your own hands. But how could you do that? I'm sure you're just a non-technical person like myself. Well, this is where Bubble's going to become your new best friend. Using a tool called Bubble, it's possible to build your own fully functional application without having to write a single line of code. Now, Bubble's going to be the most time and cost-effective way to bring your vision to life, not to mention that it's going to give you, the founder of your application, full control over everything you build. When it comes to no-code tools, Bubble is by far my favorite, as it gives you the ability to create your own fully custom database, design the interface of the app itself, stitch everything together using visual workflows, and the ability to integrate with third-party tools and services. Now, each one of these would be a standard no-code tool, whereas Bubble includes all of that inside of one single solution. So instead of paying for 4 different tools, you're only going to need to use just the one. Look, there is a ton of things that I want to cover within our tutorial today, so let's just grab a Bubble editor and we can start walking through the process. Within our build today, the first thing I wanted to cover was not how we can build out a user-facing feature as such, but instead I just wanted to take the time to set up and configure our own custom database, which will be used to power the rest of our Trello application. Now, if you're relatively new to Bubble, the process of creating a custom database from scratch can definitely seem quite overwhelming, but don't worry, it's my job today to make things as easy as possible for you. And so that's why I've taken the time to create this helpful little list, which is just going to guide us through the process. Now, whenever I create an application or a feature inside of Bubble, I personally just like to use a tool called Notion to create a checklist, which just allows me to tick items off along the way. So that way I can be sure to keep up to date with where I am throughout the build. Now, inside of this checklist, I've added all of the data types and fields we'll need to add into our database, as well as a long list of all of the features we're going to be building out within our Trello clone today. And of course, I'll be sure to share a link in the description of this video, so that way you can get access to this template and make a copy copy of it yourself. And that way you can follow along with me as we build our Trello clone. But as I mentioned, the first thing I want to cover is how we can build out the database. Now, when it comes to creating a database in Bubble, there's two particular things you'll need to understand. And that is that you'll need to create what's known as your overarching data types. And then inside of that, you'll create what's known as your data fields. Now, a data type in Bubble is just a way to create, I guess you could say, an entity. So you can think of this almost like a thing in your database. And these are the overarching things that users are actually going to create. And so the way I like to approach building out a database is that I like to think long and hard before I build anything out in Bubble about all of the individual items that users will be creating within our app. So for instance, you'll see here all of my data types are in my bold heading. So every single time someone wants to create an account, that means they're going to have to create something in our database. So I'm going to create a data type known as our user. Every single time someone wants to create a Trello board, that's going to be a thing that they're going to create. So that's why I have an overarching data type known as a board. Then I have my data type known as a list, because inside of a board, users will be able to create lists. Then of course, inside of a list, users will be able to create tasks. And so that's why tasks are broken down into their own data type. And finally, the last thing users will be able to create is comments within each task. So you can kind of see how everything is linked together within my application. And again, I get a lot of people ask me how I actually approach the system of creating a database. And this is the exact way. Normally, if I'm trying to rebuild an application like I do for my clone tutorials, I like to actually just use the application myself. And then I can see at any point in time, whenever I, as the user, create something, that means that that will be an overarching data type. So it's an entity, a thing, or an item that a user will create. Then inside every item that a user creates, we'll need to store some information about that item. And this is where your data fields come into play. So a great example is for our user data type. Whenever someone registers a user account, I'd like to store some information about each person. So I'd like to store the values of each user's name as well as their profile photo. And so these bits of information are known as your data fields. Now, if I was to jump into a brand new Bubble editor here, I haven't made any changes to it, but what I want to do is open up my data tab, because over in our data tab, the first thing you'll notice is that this is broken into two different sections. In the left-hand column, we have our data type section. So as you can see, this is where we add our custom data types. And then on the right-hand side, this is where we add all of our data fields. Now, what you'll also notice is that by default, Bubble's already added in our user data type. And that is because in order for an application to be functional, users will need to register accounts. So by default, Bubble adds this into your application. So it saves you the process of having to do that. And what you might also notice is that within your data fields, we already have some existing data fields for each user. So of course, in order for someone to register an account, they're going to need to store an email address in your database. So that's why by default, Bubble adds this email data field into your user data type. There's also a default password field, but you just won't be able to view that in plain text for security reasons, but it is definitely there. And I'll be showing you in a moment when we register user accounts how you can access that data field. But before we build out any additional data fields under our user data type, I'd personally recommend taking the time to add in all of your data types, because what you'll find is that some of your data fields actually link to data types. And I'll be sure to explain that in a moment. I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves though. So what I'm going to do is take the time to add in all of the data types that I've just mentioned within my Notion doc here. So we've got our user data type in Bubble already. The next thing I'd like to add is a board. So I'm going to jump into Bubble. I'm going to add a board data type. And just as a side note, one thing I should point out is that your data types should never be a plural. So they should always just be spelt as a singular item, because although users will be able to create multiple boards within their account, at any given time, they're only going to create one board. So please, 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 if you take anything away from this section of our tutorial right now, it's that you should never use a plural for your data type. It should always be a singular item. Then the next data type we're going to add is a list, because of course we can add lists within our boards. Then there was our task. And finally, there was our comment. And now once we've finished adding all of our data types in, this is where we can start to build out all of our data fields. So the first one I'd like to build out is our user data type. And so if you remember in my Notion checklist, I just had two simple data fields. I'm actually not going to be storing too much information about my users within our Trello clone today. I'm just going to be storing their name and their profile photo. So if I jump into Bubble, I'm going to add a new data field within my user data type. And I'm going to call this first data field the name. Now for every data field, you'll also need to store this as a type of data. So this just determines in what format this data will be stored in your database. And for our name, this is just going to be a very simple text field. It truly is as simple as that. The next field is just going to be our profile photo. Now, one thing you might just notice is that when I add 2 words in a data field, you'll just see that instead of using a space to separate these, I just separate these with a dash. Now, the reason I do that is because later on when I need to reference my data fields, I can easily see what's a data field and what's a data type, because all of my data fields are separated with a dash, whereas if I was to have 2 words in a data type, that would be separated in a space. So I just like to take the time to take care of all of the housekeeping right now as I start to build the application. But for this data field, for our profile photo, I'd like this to just be an image. It's pretty straightforward. I will create that. And now that is all of the information I'd like to store within a user's account. By all means, if you wanted to store some additional information, so I don't know, something like a user's address, maybe their phone number, maybe even their star sign, heck, I'm not one to judge. What I'd recommend doing is just pausing this tutorial now and just taking the time to create all of these data fields. But what I'm gonna do is jump back into my Notion checklist and tick off that I've finished adding these data fields into my user data type. Then I'll move along to my board. So for our board, I'm going to want to register a few details every single time someone creates a new Trello board within their account. So if I jump into my bubble editor, I'm going to select on my board data type. I'm going to choose to create a new field. And for the first field, this is just going to be known as the title of the board. So this is of course just the name that someone gives a Trello board, which again, similar to our user's name, that's just going to be a basic text field. I'll choose to create that. Then I'd like to store a featured image for this board. So this is going to be like the cover image, or I guess you could think of it as even the background image for this board. So similar to the real world Trello products, we're going to enable people to customize the actual design of their own board by uploading a custom background image. So I'm going to choose to create a new field here, and I'm going to call this field featured image, and once again this will just be an image field type. I'll choose to create that. Then finally, I'd like to create another field which is going to be known as my members. So for each Trello board, later on we're going to be building out a feature that allows someone to invite additional users to that board, so that way they can collaborate in a shared workspace. And so what I'd like to do is store a list of all of the users who are a member of a Trello board. So these are the people who should have access to it, and in this case I'd like this to be a list of users. So for our field type, what I'm going to do is scroll on down, and I'm going to link this to our user data type. And look, this is where you'll really start to see the power of Bubble's custom database tool come to life. What you can do is create what's known as a truly relational database, which just means you can intertwine all of your different data types together. And I know that might sound confusing now, but this really is what sets Bubble apart from any other no-code tool. It has an extremely powerful database feature. And so I'm going to link our members to our user data type. And because I'd like to store a list of users, I'm going to tick this option to make this a list with multiple entries. So now our members for a board will be a list of users. I can choose to create that. I can then jump back into my Notion checklist and tick off all of the data fields under my board. And the next data type I'll need to build out is our list. So within Trello, you're probably familiar with all of the different columns that are added across a Trello board, and those are known as the lists. And of course, we'll need to create a series of lists within a particular Trello board. So what we're going to do is jump into Bubble, head to our list data type, and the first field I'd like to add is just going to be the name of the list. So this is the name of each column. And for this field type, I'm going to set this to just be a simple text field. It's as easy as that. Then I'll also need to create a way to reference which Trello board this list should belong to. So if I was to open up a real example of a Trello board that I have, you'll see that I have all of these lists within this particular board. And now if I was to open up another Trello board, of course, what you'll expect is that these lists would not be displayed in that board because all of these lists belong to this one board here. And so what we're going to need to do for our list data type is create a way to link this list to this particular Trello board and that Trello board only. And so if we create a new data field, we can call this field the original board that this list should belong to. So for short, I'm just going to set that to be the OG board. And then for the field type, I'm going to link this list to a specific Trello board. And I'm not going to tick that that should be a list of entries because I only want one list to be linked to one board at a time. I don't want a list to be linked to multiple boards. So I'm going to choose to create that as a single field. And then finally, the very last data field I'd like to add for our list is going to be the position number. So inside the real world Trello app here, I can see that this list sits in position number 1. This list sits in position number 2, position number 3, and so on. And of course, we can move these around. So this list would now sit in position number 3, not position number 4. And if I was to move them back, the position would update. And so because that's a feature we're going to be creating today within our Trello clone, we're going to need to be able to store where each list should be situated within our overall board. So we're going to create a field here, and this is going to be called position number. And this field type is just going to be a number, as the name would suggest. I'll choose to create that. And that's all of the data fields I'll need to add into my list data type. I'm going to jump back into my Notion checklist and tick all of those off. And we're starting to work our way through the full list here. The next list of data fields I'd like to add in is going to be with our task data type. So in Trello, all of these cards here that sit within a list are known as our tasks. So we're going to need to store some information for each of these. So if I click on my task data type, the first field I'm going to create is just called, once again, the title. So this is going to be the name of the task itself. And of course, that's just going to be a simple text field. So I'll create that. Then what I'd also like to do is create a field known as the image. So in Trello, you can see that you can upload custom thumbnail images to each of these tasks. So I'm just going to create a field called image, and I will set the field type to be an image, as the name would suggest. I'll choose to create that. Then for each task, I'd also like to store a description. So this is the copy that someone can actually write inside of a particular task. So you can see here, this has all of the notes for this task. So I'm going to create another data field here. I'll be calling this description. And for the field type, I'm going to set this to just be a text field. Truly is as simple as that. And then finally, I'd like to link each task to a specific list. So once again, in my real world Trello app here, you can see that each of these tasks belong to a specific list. And these are of course interchangeable between lists. And that's a feature we're going to be creating today. But of course, I'll just need to recognize which list a task belongs to at any given time. So I'm going to jump back into Bubble. I'll create a new data field. And this field is just going to be known as the current list for this particular task. And of course, we're going to link this to our list data type. So the field type will just be a list, and one task will only be able to belong to one list at a time. So I'm not going to select that that should be a list with multiple entries. I'll choose to create that. That is all of the data fields I'll need to add into my task. So I'm going to jump back into Bubble and I will tick all of those off. And the very last data fields I'll need to add in are just going to be within our comment data type. So inside of each task in Trello, you can add comments to things. So you can see here, I've added some comments onto this task. And that is of course a feature we're going to replicate today. So we're going to jump back into Bubble. We're going to open up our comment data type and we're going to choose to create a new field here. And for every comment, there's two pieces of information I'll need to store. One is going to be the content of the comment. So this is, I guess you could say, the text of the comment. And this field type is just going to be a standard text field. It is as simple as that. And then finally, the last bit of information I'd like to store for a comment is that I want to link each comment to a specific task. So that way I know which task to display that comment within. And so I'm going to create another field here and I'm going to call this field OG task. So this is the original task that this comment should belong to. And so for this field type, I'm going to link this to my task data type. And one comment should only belong to one task at a time. It won't belong to multiple tasks. So I will not select that that is a list with multiple entries. I'll then choose to create this field. Then jumping back into Notion, I'm going to check off that I've finished building out all of these data fields. And that is everything I'll need to add into our custom database. But there is one last thing I'd just like to show you before we jump ahead and start building out all of the core features for our application. And that is within our database, you may have noticed that next to your user data type, you have this text that displays that there is a privacy rule applied to a user data type. Now, if I was to click into this privacy rule, it's going to open up our privacy tab here. And in short, Bubble has added a default privacy rule to our user data type, which just means that users in our application will only ever be able to see any of the data that they create themselves. So let's say you have a Trello board and you've created some tasks and even some lists on it, and then you send me an invite to view and also edit your Trello Trello board. As it currently stands, I would not be able to view your Trello board because this privacy rule stands in the way. And so that's not an experience we want to create. So what I'm going to do is just take the time to delete this privacy rule here. And now what you'll see back in our data tab is that our user data type is publicly visible. So please take the time to remove that privacy rule. You'd be surprised how many people send me an email saying their application doesn't work, when in fact they just haven't taken the time to delete this privacy rule, which means they're unable to view other users' information. But as it stands, that's everything we'll need to add into our own custom database. As you can see, it truly is never easier to create a completely custom database of your own without writing a single line of code using Bubble. Moving down through our list of features I have set out for us today, I actually want to skip ahead and build out one of the core pages that users are going to interact with throughout our application. And that is, of course, going to be the Trello homepage. So you can think of this as a dashboard page that's just going to display a list of someone's Trello boards that they've created, as well as a list of all of the Trello boards that they've been invited to join. Now, there is a little bit involved in building out this page. So we're just going to jump over to our Bubble editor. And I'm going to open up the index page that's created by default whenever you build a brand new application. And so if you remember in our first module, I'd mentioned that the index page comes standard in any application. And by default, it is in fact blank. If we were to double click on the page and open up our property editor, the first thing I'd like to do on this page is just update the background color to be a light shade of gray, just so I can see where it actually lies inside of my Bubble editor. I'm then going to jump over to my layout tab because I'd like to update the container layout for this page. Now, similar to any overall page structure, I'm going to be stacking elements from top to bottom, which means I'm going to need to set the container layout to be a column, not a row. So I'm going to select the column option here. Now, when it comes to the elements I want to actually add onto our homepage, the first thing I'd like to do is build out a header navigation menu, which is going to be displayed across the top section of our page. So in that navigation menu, this is going to display things like the Trello logo, as well as some links, which when clicked will redirect users to the different pages in our app. Now, when it comes to building out this header navigation menu, I could by all means build it directly on this page itself. So I could just add a group on this page and add everything I need inside of that group. However, because I want to use this navigation menu across every single page in my application, I'm not going to build it directly on this page, but instead I'm going to use something in Bubble known as a reusable element. Now, if you're brand new to Bubble, reusable elements, as the name would suggest, allows you to build an element once and then reuse it across any section of your application. So instead of having to manually build and copy and paste a navigation menu across every single page in your application, with a reusable element, you can build that header navigation menu once and then easily just add it onto any page. Now, reusable elements are a little bit more of an advanced feature if you are relatively new to Bubble, but I just wanted to take the time to explain the steps involved in using them today, just because they are such an essential feature for any navigation menu. And now, in order to create a reusable element, what we'll need to do is head over to our page drop-down menu in the top left-hand corner. And below our list of pages, you'll see this option to add a new reusable element. So we're going to click on this and we're going to call this our header menu. I'll choose to create this. Then once that element has been created, it's going to redirect us through to almost like another page editor. And this is where you can actually build out the structure of the reusable element itself. So if I was to double click on this particular element, I'm going to jump over to my appearance tab. What you'll see is that you have three different options as to what you can choose this reusable element is going to be. So you can either have this as a group, a pop-up, or a floating group. And thankfully in our example today, things are going to be relatively straightforward. We're just going to keep it as the standard default option, which is a group. What I would like to do though with this reusable element is first of all jump over to my layout tab, because this reusable element is currently a group, which means that similar to any traditional group we would add onto our page, we have the ability to update its container layout, which will just determine in which way elements are positioned inside of this group. So for the container layout, because I'm going to be creating a header navigation menu, I'm going to want everything to stretch horizontally across my page, which means in this instance, I'm going to need to select the row option. Then once I've selected the container layout, I'll be able to update things like the width settings for this group. And the first thing I want to update is the width of our UI builder. So right now it's currently set to 200 pixels in width, which is why this element is quite short. What I'm going to do is actually set this to 960 pixels. Now, by all means, it doesn't really matter what value you add into this section here. This is only the width of what this element looks like inside of your Bubble editor, which is the UI builder. So while this looks like it's 960 pixels in width here. It currently has a minimum width of 0 and a maximum width is infinite, which means it's going to be as small or as large as it possibly can be on any given page. And so if I was to jump over into my responsive menu here and either expand my page or collapse my page, what you'll see is that this reusable element is fully responsive, just because, as I mentioned, it can take up as little or as much space as it possibly can on our page. And so today we're going to be making this element fully responsive across any device. Now, if I jump back into my UI builder here, the other thing I'd like to do just before I come back and update the height of this reusable element is jump over into our appearance tab, because I'd like to update the background color for this reusable element. And today, when it comes to the background color, I'm going to have this be a shade of blue that Trello uses on their own application. If you'd like this, it's 007 AC0. And now you'll see we have this nicely colored navigation menu, but of course we'll need to start adding in all of the elements we'd like to display within the menu. And now when it comes to our navigation menu today, I'm going to break this down into two different sections. So on one side of our navigation menu, I'm going to display things like a logo, some text which will link to a different page in our application, as well as a button which will be used to create a new Trello board. And then on the right hand side of our navigation menu, I'd like to display things like a user's profile photo, as well as an icon element which when clicked will redirect someone through to a settings page. And because I'd like to break this down into two different sections, what I'm going to do is actually add in two separate groups inside of my existing group here. And you'll see why I do that in a moment, but essentially it's just going to give me more control over how I can structure the elements I add inside of our overall navigation menu here. So what I'm going to do is head over to my containers and I'm going to add a group inside of my existing group. And if I really wanted, I could even update the name of this group to be called group left. So that way I know this is the group that's going to be positioned on the left-hand side of my menu. Now, while I'm working on this group, what I am going to do is choose to remove the style of this, because I'd like to give this a flat color as the background. And I'm going to actually set this to be a light shade of red. Now, while this might look completely bizarre within your bubble editor, the reason why I color code my groups is because it just allows me to visualize where all of my elements actually sit on the page. If I was to, let's say, leave this with a transparent background, and if I was to click away, I can't actually see that there's a group there. It's only when I click on it that I notice it exists. Whereas if I have a flat background color, it kind of looks like I'm adding a bunch of different Lego blocks together. So that way it's much more visually enticing to actually create an application. So I'd always recommend trying to color code your groups as well. Now, when it comes to this group, before I make any changes to it, I'm also just going to make another copy of it. Only this time I'm going to update the background color to be something like a light shade of green. And of course, I'll also need to update the name of this to be called group right, because this is going to be the group that's positioned on the right hand side of my overall navigation menu. And it's from here that I can take the time to build out all of the elements that are going to sit inside both of my groups. So in my red group, what I'd like to do is, as I mentioned, start by displaying a logo for Trello. But before I do that, I'm going to need to, of course, update the container layout of this new group. So I'm going to jump to my layout tab. I'm going to head to the container layout. And now when it comes to the elements inside of this group, I'm also going to want to position these horizontally, which means I'm going to need to select the row option. And before I add any elements in, I'm also going to update the width settings for this group. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. And if I set a minimum width of 0 and leave a maximum width of infinite, this group is going to take up as little or as much space as it can within my overall blue group. And of course, I will come back and update the height in a moment. But before I do that, I'm going to add all of my elements I want inside of this red group. And so as I mentioned, the first thing is going to be a logo. So if I head to my visual elements, I'll add an image element into my red group. Now, when it comes to this image, I just have a Trello logo saved on my local device here. So I'm going to upload this as a static image. Then once I've uploaded my image, what I'd like to do is, of course, jump over to my layout tab so I can update the dimensions of this. Look, when it comes to the width of this, it's currently set at a fixed value of 320 pixels. What I'm going to do is set this to be a fixed width of 80 pixels. And the reason why I'm setting this as a fixed width is because I don't want this element to expand or contract based on the size of our page. I'm always going to want it to be whatever particular size I set it to be right now. And for that size, I'm also going to select the option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed. And if I fix it at a 2:1 ratio, this is going to look more like a reasonable scale for this logo. I'm then going to choose to vertically align this element in the center of my red group. And then finally, I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top top, 10 on the bottom, and 30 on the left, which is just going to ensure that when I collapse my red group, it won't touch the borders of my image itself. Beside this, I'm then going to add in a text element, which will work as almost like a hyperlink within our application. So if I head to my visual elements, I'm going to add a text element in, and I'm going to have this display the words workspace. I might even just add a S on that so it can be a plural. I'm then going to choose to remove the style of this text because I'd like to update the font size here to be 16 pixels. I will align this text in the center of the element as well as bold the text itself. And then finally, I'm going to set the font color here to be white. I'll then jump over to my layout tab because I'd like to update the layout settings for this element. And when it comes to the width of this text element, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width as 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. Only what you might notice is that because the text isn't very long, there's all of this empty space on both sides of the element. So what I'm actually going to do is select this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. And what that's going to do is make this collapse nicely around the actual text inside of the element. So that way I'm not going to have all of this empty space that's unused. For the height, I'm then going to set the minimum height to be 0, which means it's going to collapse nicely around the text inside of it as well. I'll then vertically align this in the center of my red group, so that way it's in line with our logo there. And then finally, I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom, and 15 pixels of margin on the left. So that way this element is spaced away from my previous image element. Then finally, the very last element I'd like to add inside of this red group is just going to be a button, which when clicked is going to trigger a workflow to allow someone to create a new Trello board. So I'm going to head to my visual elements. I'll add a button element into our red group. I'll have this display the word create. When it comes to this button, I'm happy to use our primary button style here. Only I would just like to remove this style because I'd like to make one minor tweak. And that is that I want to choose to bold the text inside of it. It's nothing too major. I'll then jump over into my layout tab because of course I'll need to update the layout settings for this button. And when it comes to the width of this particular button, what I'm going to do is actually unselect that this should be a fixed width, which now means that because this button has a maximum width of infinite, it's going to scale out and take up as much space as it possibly can in our red group. And that's obviously not the experience we want to create. What I am interested in doing though is setting the minimum width as 0 and leaving the maximum width at 100, which just means at the largest possible size, this button will be 100 pixels in width, but at the smallest possible size, this button will reduce down, which just means that over in my responsive tab, if I was to reduce the size of our page, you'll see that this button will reduce in width as the page decreases. And that's because it has a minimum width of 0. I'll just jump back into my UI builder for now though, because there's a few more configurations we'll need to change. Over in my layout tab, I'd also like to set the minimum height of this button to be 40, just because I want to make the button slightly slimmer. I'm then going to choose to vertically align this in the center of my red group. And then finally, I'll add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom, 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And the reason why I'm adding margin on the right is because this is the very last element I'd like to position within my red group here. Now that's all of the elements I'd like to add inside of my red group. So I'm going to click on my red group here. I'm going to head to my layout tab and I'm going to need to update the minimum height of this group, and I'll be setting that to be 0. And that means it's going to collapse nicely around all of the existing elements that sit inside of the group. I'm then going to want to vertically align this group in the center of my overall blue group. And of course, we'll be doing the exact same thing for our green group in a moment, just so that way these can be perfectly aligned. But now over in my green group, which is my group right, I'm going to add 2 elements inside of this group. One will be an icon and the other will be a user's profile photo. And so what I'm going to do is head over to my layout tab. And the first thing I'll need to do is update the container layout. Now, because I'll be displaying these 2 elements side by side, so horizontally, I'm going to need to once again set the container layout to be a row. Then when it comes to this group, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width as 0, and for the time being, I'm going to leave the maximum width as infinite. I will come back and make a slight change in a moment, but before I do that, I'm going to add both of my elements into this group. So the first element, as I mentioned, is just going to be an icon, which when clicked will redirect someone through to a settings page. So if I head to my visual elements, I'm going to choose to add an icon element into this green group, and I'm just going to search for the cog icon. So this is like a little settings gear. Now for this icon, I'm going to remove the default style because I'd like to update the color to be white. I'm then going to jump over to my layout tab, and for the width and height, I'm going to set this to be 40 pixels by 40 pixels. And because both of these values are fixed, this icon will only ever be this size. It's not going to shrink or grow based on the size of the page. It'll always just be 40 by 40. I'll then vertically align this in the center of my green group here. And then I'll just add in 10 pixels of margin at the top and 10 pixels of margin on the bottom. And then finally, beside this, I'd like to add in my last element of my navigation menu, and that is going to be someone's profile photo. So if I head to my visual elements, I'm going to add an image element into my green group. And because I'd like to display someone's profile photo, which they've stored in our database, I'm going to choose to insert dynamic data, which will allow me to reference data stored in my database. And I'd like to display the current user. So that is the person who is currently logged in viewing our app. I'd like to display their profile photo. And just a personal preference of mine is that when I'm working with images, I like to select the more option because I personally like to process images with Imgix. And that's going to give me the option to tick this choice here, which will allow me to resize and fit the dimensions of any image by cropping them. So in simple terms, it just means that it's going to scale this image out to fit this entire space here. Now, before I update any of the layout settings for this image, I'd just like to make a few quick changes to the styling of it. I'm going to choose to remove the style here. I'm going to scroll on down and I'm going to give this image a solid border while I'm working on it. So that way, if I click away, I can actually see where this image lies on my page. Now, by all means, when you go to preview or publish your application, you can remove that solid border. But just while I'm working in my editor, I like to have it present. I'll then click on my image again because I'd like to update the roundness of its borders to be 100. So that way it's soon going to become a perfect circle. And if I jump over to my layout tab here, I'm going to update the width of this image. I'm going to set that to be 40 pixels. And I'm going to leave that as a fixed width because I'll only ever want this to be 40 pixels, no smaller or no larger. What I would like to do though is select this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed at a 1:1 ratio, which means it's now going to be a perfect square. So 40 pixels by 40 pixels. I'll of course then vertically align this element in the center of my green group. And finally, I'll just add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom, 10 on the left, but 30 on the right hand side. And because that's both of the elements I'd like to add into my green group, I'm going to select on the group itself. I will update its height. So I'm going to set this to be 0 pixels. I'll then select to vertically align this group in the center of my blue group, which of course now means that it's in line with our existing group on the left-hand side. But what you'll notice is that we have all of this empty space on the right-hand side of my elements here. And so what I'm actually going to do is update the width settings of this green group. And so at this point in time, because this group has a maximum width of infinite, it's trying to take up as much space as it possibly can on our overall element. So that's our reusable element, the blue group. Whereas if I was to select this option to fit the width of this group to the content inside of it, it's going to collapse this group around the elements that lie within it. And of course, because I've got some margin around my image element, it's just going to ensure that the borders of the green group don't touch any of my elements themselves. But what you'll now see is that with our header navigation menu, everything's starting to take the structure of a proper navigation menu that you're normally used to seeing within any app. Now, before I close off all of this empty space for our blue group here, what I'd like to do is quickly just build out a few workflows that are going to allow users to navigate between the different pages in our app. So the first navigation experience I'd like to create is on our workspaces text. So whenever someone clicks this text, I want to be able to redirect them through to our homepage. So if I jump to my appearance tab here, I can choose to start a workflow whenever this text element is clicked. And within this, as I mentioned, I'm going to want to send someone through to our homepage. So if I head to my workflow events here, I'm going to select from the navigation actions and choose the go to page event. I'll then set the destination page to be our index page, which is going to be our home page. It's as simple as that. That's all I'll need to change. And the other workflow I'd just like to build out for the time being is a navigation event that runs whenever someone clicks on this little settings cog. So I'm going to choose to start a workflow when this cog icon is clicked. I'll once again head to the navigation actions, select the go to page event, and I'll set the destination page here to be the settings page. And I won't need to send any data through in this workflow. It truly is as simple as that. Later on throughout another module, I am going to explain how we can create a new board whenever this button is clicked, but I won't focus on that right now. Instead, what I'd like to do is just finish designing the actual header navigation menu itself. Now, on a side note, one thing I should also just point out is that because we built our workflows in our overall reusable element here, so these are the workflows that run whenever the workspaces or the settings icon is clicked, we won't actually need to rebuild those workflows workflows on a separate page. And so this is the power of reusable elements. Because we've added the workflows on our reusable element here, they will be functional regardless of where we add this header menu on any page of our app. So once again, you build it once and then you can use it as many times as you would like. From here though, we're going to select on our overall blue group. We're going to jump over to our layout tab. And the last thing I'd like to do here is just set the minimum height to be 0, which means that it's going to collapse around all of the elements that lie within it. And just like that, that is how we can design our header navigation menu. But if I was to jump over into my responsive tab here, this is where you'll start to see a few flaws arise. So if I was viewing this on a desktop device, this is going to look perfectly fine because we've got all of this room to display all of our elements. However, if I was to start reducing the width of my browser, once these elements collide here, you'll start to see that this really doesn't create a nice responsive experience for the end user. And so what I want to do here is show you how we can actually create a fully responsive experience. And it just requires us to use a very common feature in Bubble known as conditions, which throughout our tutorial today, you'll see me leverage quite a few times. But if I wanted to create a fully responsive menu here, what I'd personally like to do is start to either change or remove some of these elements from my header navigation menu whenever the page starts to reduce in size. And so if I was to click on my workspaces text, what I could do is choose to head over to our conditional tab. And conditions in Bubble allow you to determine what should happen when a certain behavior is met. So for example, if I was to say, whenever the page is below 480 pixels here, I would like to hide this text element so that way our button can move across and take its place. And so I'm going to define a condition here and I'm going to type in the word width and I'm going to select the option which recognizes when the current page width, and then I can say when the current page width is less than. So I'm going to select the less than operator and then I can type in the number of pixels I want it to be less than. So I can say 480 pixels here. What I'd like to do is recognize when the current page width is below 480 pixels. What I'm going to do is select that this element is visible and I'm not going to tick that that should be true, which means that this element would in fact disappear, as you can see here. But what you might notice though is that although this element is not visible, it still takes up all of this space inside of our red group. And so if I jump over into our layout tab, I can actually choose to select this option here to collapse this element when it's hidden. And that just means that when this element is no longer visible, it's not going to take up any space on our overall page. So it's going to allow our button here to move over and take its place. And if I was to reevaluate the actual responsive settings of my header menu here, what you'll now see is that as we reduce the width of our page, our button element still is just slightly not entirely responsive. So what we'll need to do is create yet another condition on that. And now one thing I should point out in Bubble is that when you're designing the responsive settings of your page, what you'll see here is that a mobile device is factored in at 320 pixels. So this is the smallest possible mobile device that someone could be viewing your application on. So think of something like an iPhone 5. I have found that most modern iPhones, so things like an iPhone X or up, will normally take about 380 pixels on your page. So that'll sit around this mark here. But of course, we want to make that fully responsive experience that's nice for anyone across any device size. So what I'm going to do is select on my create button here, and I'm just going to head over to my conditional tab. And inside of this tab, I'm going to create a new condition, and I'm once again going to type in the word width because I'd like to recognize when the current page width is less than, and I'm going to say around about 370 pixels. And the reason why I'm selecting 370 is because that if I start reducing the width of my page, you can see it's around this point that my button starts to actually collapse. So I'm going to recognize when the current page width is at 370 pixels or less. What I'm going to do is update the text inside of this button. And instead of displaying the full word create, what I'm going to do is just display a little plus icon. Now, if I was to reduce the width of this, you'll now see that this button can afford to collapse even more because our plus icon doesn't take up as much space as the word create. And at 320 pixels, that's going to fit quite nicely on my page. So what you'll now see is that as I scale my menu out, all of the elements are going to be displayed. And when I reduce the width of my page, the elements will be hidden and then the condition will trigger on our button, which will cause it to take up less space. And that is how we can create a truly responsive responsive experience across our navigation menu. And although it took about half an hour to actually build out this navigation menu, we actually never need to build it again. And that's because we've created a reusable element today. So let's jump over into our home page, so our index page, and add this navigation menu onto that page. So if we open up our page drop-down menu, we're going to jump back to our index page. Now at this point in time, our page is still blank, whereas what I'd like to do is now add our header navigation menu onto this page. So I'm just going to move my head out of the way for a second, because if I scroll right down to the bottom of my element menu, you'll see we have the option here to add in our reusable elements. And of course, one of those is our header menu. So I'm going to add that onto my page. And what you'll see is that it's going to copy across all of the elements we've previously added into it. Now, if you ever want to make changes to the header navigation menu, if you were to hover over this element, you'll see that you're unable to select any of the elements inside of it. So if you ever need to make changes, you're going to have to open up the reusable element itself and make changes there. And of course, they'll be reflected on your page in real time, because this element on our page is just referencing everything we've added in our navigation menu. But thankfully, now you can finally start to see we've added something onto this page to bring it to life. The next thing I'd like to add on our page is just going to be a series of Trello boards that people can click on. And of course, when they select on those, they're going to be redirected through to a page where they can actually view those Trello boards. But before I do that, what I'll need to do is add a text element on my page that's going to work like a heading. So I'm going to scroll on up to my visual elements, and I'll add a text element on my page. And I'll have this element display the words "your boards," and I'm going to keep that in all capitals. I'm then going to choose to remove the style of this because I'd like to update the font size to be 20 pixels. I'm then going to choose to bold this text. And of course, I'll then need to make this element fully responsive. So I'm going to jump over to my layout tab. I will unselect that this should be a fixed width. Like any text element, I'm going to set the minimum width as 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite, which means it can take up as little or as much space as it possibly can on my page. I'll then set the minimum height to be 0. And because we have the default option selected to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, it's going to wrap nicely around all of the text there. And then finally, when it comes to the margins, I'm going to add in 40 pixels of margin at the top, 20 pixels of margin on the left, and 20 pixels of margin on the right. And that's just going to realign the position of this text element on my page. Now below this, what I want to do is display a list of Trello boards that someone has created. And if you're new to Bubble, in order to display a list, you're going to need to use a element known as a repeating group. And so if we head to our containers menu, you'll see this option to add in a repeating group. Now repeating groups in Bubble are going to be your best friend. What they allow you to do is display a full list of information that's stored within your database or anywhere else inside of your app. And a great example of when you would use a repeating group, aside from our example today, is if let's say you were building something like an Instagram clone, and let's say on your homepage you wanted to add in a feed of Instagram posts. A repeating group is the element you would use. So within a repeating group, it kind of looks just like a spreadsheet, and that's because it's going to display a list of items pulled from your database. So what you would do is you would edit the contents of your first Instagram post in the first cell of your repeating group, and then Bubble would automatically populate the rest of them by pulling data from your database. And you can actually choose what data Bubble needs to pull from it. So you can kind of create like your own little algorithm. And repeating groups can be a little bit tedious to get the hang of, but of course it is my job here to make things as easy as possible for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump over into our appearance tab. Now, when it comes to a repeating group, the first thing you'll need to do is give it a data source, because as I mentioned, this repeating group is going to pull a list of information from your database. In this case, I'm going to want to display a list of Trello boards that a particular user has created. And so what we'll need to do is first of all set the type of content we'd like to display inside of this list. And I'd like this to be a list of Trello boards. It's nice and straightforward. But then when it comes to the data source, I'm going to need to reference which data I want to pull from my database and display onto our page. So I'd like to display a list of all of the Trello boards that the current user, so the person who's logged into their account, has created. So for this data source, I'm going to actually perform a search in my database for all of the Trello boards. And what I'll now do is add a constraint, which just allows me to filter through which Trello boards I actually want to search for. So at this point, we're searching for every single Trello board that's been created, whereas I actually only want to display the boards that someone has created themselves. So I'm going to add what's known as a constraint. There is also like a filter. And I'm going to recognize that I only want to display all of the boards where the created by field, so the person who created them in our database, equals the current user. So that is the person who is currently logged in and is viewing their own homepage. And that's all we'll need to configure for our data source here. The next thing I'd like to do is just unselect both of these options here. So at this point in time, this repeating group is just displaying a fixed number of rows, which is 4. So let's say if a user has created 10 Trello boards, right now it's only going to display 4 of those, whereas I want to make sure it just displays however many a user has created. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed number of rows. And I'm also going to unselect that this should be a fixed number of columns. And what that's going to do is just allow our repeating group to expand across the page and show as many columns and cells as it possibly can. So if a user's got 10 Trello boards, it'll display 10. If they've got 24, it'll display 24. Now I will need to come back and update a setting here in a moment, but before I do that, what I'd also like to do is jump over into my layout tab. Now a repeating group, as the name would suggest, is a list of groups that are repeatable. And of course, when you're working with groups, you have the ability to update the container layout. And it's no different with a repeating group. Inside of each cell, we can determine how all of the elements should be structured. So for the container layout here, I'm going to actually set this to be a row. Now I'm only going to add in one element into our repeating group. So to be fair, you could also choose the column option, because realistically, we're not going to be stacking elements horizontally or vertically. There's only going to be one element inside of it. The reason why I want to choose the row option though, is it's going to give me some additional options here to update the container alignment, which just means that I can make sure that whatever element I add into this will always be centered in the position of my group. And then from here, I'm going to head on down to my width settings, and I'm going to unselect that our overall repeating group should not be a fixed width. Like any element, I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width to be infinite. So now our repeating group is going to take up as little or as much space as it possibly can on our page. And what I also love about repeating groups is that if I head over to my responsive tab, I'm just going to close that there. If I was to scale this page out, you'll see the bubble will just continually add in more cells of our repeating group. Whereas if I was to reduce the width of our page, it will continually take those cells away. So it automatically knows how many it should display across our page. And of course, it will also stack these vertically if you start to reduce the actual width of the page. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. But from here, I'm just going to jump back into my UI builder. I'm going to double click on my repeating group, and I'm going to head over to my appearance tab. Now, inside of our repeating group, what I'd like to do is just display a card, which is going to show the background image of whatever Trello board has been created. As well as inside of that, I'd like to display the text of the name of the Trello board itself. But right now, as you can see, the cells within our repeating group are quite small. So I'm just going to need to expand the width of these out. So for the minimum width here, what I'm actually going to do is set this to be 320 pixels. And now the reason why I've selected 320 pixels is because if you remember, at the smallest possible device size viewing our application, it will be 320 pixels on a mobile device. And so if I jump into my responsive menu once again and select on the mobile device at 320 pixels, you'll see that at our smallest possible device size, this is going to be the perfect size for the mobile device itself. And so that just means that each Trello board is going to fit perfectly on each line of our repeating group. So that's all I want to change there for now. What I would like to do from here though is add in the actual information of each Trello board that I want to display. And when it comes to the Trello boards, I'm just going to want to display the background image of the Trello board as well as the name of the Trello board. It's a relatively straightforward process. I don't want to display too much information, but the way I'm actually going to display the background image of this board is not by using an image element. Instead, I want to use a group element. And the reason why I'm using a group is because they actually have the ability to set a background image as the background style. And then that means that because this is a group element, I can actually add a text element inside of this. So it's going to create the appearance that looks like the text is actually overlaid over the top of the image. And that's because it will be. So for our group here, what I'm going to do is first of all, remove the style of this, and I'm going to update the background style to be an image. Now, when it comes to the image, I want this to display the image that someone has added when they create a Trello board. So throughout our product today, we're going to build out a feature that of course allows someone to create a Trello board. And when they do that, we're going to allow them to upload a custom background image to that. And so in this case, what I'd like to do is display that custom background image as the background of this group. So what I can do is select from this dynamic image field, which means that I can dynamically pull some data from my database and display it as the image. And of course, the image I'd like to display is going to be the background image of the board inside of each repeating group cell. So I'm going to select to insert dynamic data, and I'm going to display the current cells board. Now, what Bubble means by the current cells option here is that within each repeating group cell, this is going to be be displaying a different Trello board. So in cell number 1, we're going to be displaying board number 1 in our database. In cell number 2, we'll be displaying board number 2. Cell number 3 will be board number 3, and so on. And so just by referencing the current cell's board, that just means that it's going to pull the data from whatever cell this group sits within inside of our repeating group. And what I'd like to do is reference the current cell's board, the featured image, which of course will now display the actual image itself. Now, another personal preference I have of mine when I'm working with images is that I always like to select this more option and then select the process with index choice. And that's because I like to tick this option here to resize and fit the dimensions by cropping them. And that just means that it's going to automatically expand and stretch our image out to take up all of the space within our image element. So it's just going to create a much nicer user experience. But again, by all means, this isn't completely necessary. It's just a personal preference that I have. I'm going to choose to close this here. And another thing I should point out while we're working on our group element here is that what happens if a user has not taken the time to upload a custom image to their Trello board? We obviously won't want this group to be blank as it is now. And thankfully, within our property editor here, you'll see we have this option to add a custom background color if the image field is empty. So that just means that if a user has not taken the time to upload a custom background image, we can default this to be a particular color, which in our Trello build today, this is going to be the default blue Trello color that I've used in our header menu. So if you'd like this color code, it's 007AC0. And so this is the color that's going to be displayed if someone has not uploaded a custom background image. Look, while we're also working on this group, I'm just going to update the roundness of its borders to be 10. So that way it has some curved edges. Then I'll need to jump over into my layout tab because of course I'll need to make this element fully responsive. The first thing I'm going to do is update the container layout. Now inside of this group, I'm going to display one element. However, I would like to position that from top to bottom. So what I'm going to do is select that the container layout should be a column because I'm positioning this vertically inside of this group. Then from here, we're going to jump on down to our width settings and I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width, which just means that this group is going to take up as much space as it possibly can inside of our repeating group cell. Now, when it comes to the minimum width, traditionally I would set this at 0 and of course leave the maximum width as infinite. But today, what I actually want to do is set the minimum width to be 300 pixels. And the reason why I'm doing that is because around the borders of this group inside of my repeating group cell, I'm going to want to add 10 pixels of margin. So I'm going to add 10 at the top, 10 at the bottom, 10 on the left, and 10 on the right. And what this means is that in terms of the width of this group, if it is set at a minimum width of 300 pixels, and we factor in the 10 pixels of margin on each side of this group, that's going to equal 320 pixels in total, which of course is the smallest possible size that someone could view our application on any mobile device. And so this is going to help create that fully responsive experience that we want. The other thing I'll change is also the minimum height. To make this more of a landscape image, I'm going to set the minimum height to be 200 pixels. And by all means, the reason I came to that number is I just experimented around with what dimensions would work. If I was to set it at 250, you'll see this is still more like a square. Whereas if I set that at 200 pixels, this is going to be more like a landscape image. And that's everything we'll need to configure for this group. The next thing I'd like to do is add the text element that's going to display the name of this Trello board. So I'm going to head over to my visual elements. And I'm going to add a text element inside of my group. Now, as I mentioned, for this text element, I want to display the name of the Trello board. However, I can't actually pull any data from my repeating group that contains our Trello board. And that's because this text element doesn't actually sit directly inside of our repeating group. It actually sits inside of our blue group here. So you can kind of think of this like a chain of elements, or almost like one of those Russian dolls where you pull different sections out. So right now we have our main data source, which is our repeating group, which is of course displaying a list of Trello boards. Then inside of that, we have our blue group, which is displaying the background image or our flat color. And then of course, inside of that, we now have our text element, which I want to display the title of a Trello board. But in order to reference the title of the Trello board, which that data is being stored in our repeating group layer, I'm going to need to pass some data on through the group that this text element sits within. So if I click on our blue group here, what I can do is head over to the type of content, and I can actually set a data source on this group. group. And this is why groups are such a powerful element inside of Bubble. Not only do they give you the ability to update the container layout settings, but you can also store and pass data on within them. So for the type of content here, I'd like to store the data of a Trello board inside of this group. And for the Trello board that I'd like to reference, I just want this to be the current cells board. So that means it's going to pull out the relevant information from the repeating group cell that this sits within. And now this means that if I was to click on my text element once again, I can choose to insert dynamic data, and you'll see I have this option to pull data from the parent group's board. And so because our text element sits inside of our blue group here, the blue group is known as its parent because it is taking care of that text element. So I can reference the parent group's board, and I'm going to display its title. It's nice and straightforward. I will, however, remove the style of this text element because I'd like to update some of the font settings. And the first thing I'll change is just the font size. I'll set that to be 18. I'll then also choose to bold this font, and of course update the color of this to be white so that way it stands out. I'll then need to make this element fully responsive, so I'm going to jump over to my layout tab. I will unselect that this should be a fixed width. Now, similar to all my text elements, I will in fact set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite, so that way it's going to take up as little or as much space as it possibly can inside of our blue group. I'll then update the minimum height to also be 0, and because we have this option selected to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, it's going to collapse nicely around all of the text. And then finally, I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the bottom, 10 on the left, and 10 on the right. And that's just going to ensure that this text element does not touch the borders of my blue group. And to be honest, that's everything I'm going to add into this group here. And it also completes everything I want to add into this repeating group. So the last thing I'll need to do is just close off all of this empty space at the bottom of my repeating group here. So I'm going to select on my repeating group. I'm going to head to my layout tab, and I'm going to head on down to the minimum height settings, and I'm going to set that to be 0. And what you'll now see is that our repeating group is going to collapse nicely around all of our Trello boards that sit inside of it. And that is exactly how we can create our first repeating group. Of course, on this page, not only would I like to display a list of all of the Trello boards that someone has created, but I'd also like to display a list of all of the Trello boards that they're a member of. So these are boards that they haven't created but have joined. So that means that someone has invited this user to join that board. And so what I'm going to do is create another repeating group on my page. But because we've already created our first repeating group, we can streamline the whole process by just creating a duplicate of this. The first thing I'm going to do is make a copy of our text element here. And I'm just going to move this to the next position on my page. And I'm going to update this text here to display the words guest boards. Then from here, I'm going to select on my repeating group, make a copy of that, and I will also move this to the next position on our page so it sits right at the bottom. Now, when it comes to the layout settings of this repeating group, we won't need to change a single thing, and that's because we've already taken the time to configure all of the settings on our first repeating group. The only thing I would like to change though for our second repeating group is the data source, because if I jump over to my appearance tab, you may remember that in the data source for our first repeating group, we were performing a search for all of the Trello boards that were created by the current user. Whereas in this case, as I mentioned, I only want to display the Trello boards that were not created by the current user and where the current user is actually a member of that board. And so what we'll need to do is just change some of the constraints, or I guess the filters for this search. And so the first thing I'd like to change is this created by constraint. And so instead of searching for all of the boards created by the current user, I'm going to select the second option here, which is known as the is not option. So this little symbol here just means that the created by is not the current user. So I'm only showing boards that the current user has not created in our database. I'd also like to add one additional constraint and also not only search for all of the boards that were not created by the current user, but I also want to display the boards where the members contains the current user. So that means that even though the person has not created this board, they're still a member of that board. And that's all I'll need to change for our data source here. The only other thing I'd like to change with our repeating group is that in the actual group that displays the actual Trello board itself, not only do I want to display the name of the actual board, but I'd just like to display the name of the person who's created that board. So what I could do is just select on my text element inside of my second repeating group. I can make a copy of that, click on my blue group and paste that version in. And all I'll need to do is update the dynamic text here. So I could reference the parent group's board, the creator of that board, which is of course a user, and then I can reference the name of the person who created that board. Finally, I'd then just like to update the style of this text. So I'm going to set the font size here to be 12. And I might also just like to jump over to my layout tab and just remove that top margin of 20. I'm going to set that to be 0. In fact, I could actually even just set that to be 10. Then I could select on the first text element inside of this group and set its bottom margin to be 0. And now I'll have 10 pixels of margin between these two elements. And I know we've spent a long time building our homepage up to this point, but that truly concludes the last thing I'd like to add onto this section of our tutorial here. Of course, if you were to go and take a preview of this application right now, what you'll see is that there's actually not much on your homepage. Because our repeating groups are displaying a list of Trello boards, and we haven't yet built out the feature to actually create a Trello board, there wouldn't be any data to display inside of these repeating groups themselves. So all you'd see are some empty lines around the repeating groups, which are the borders of the repeating group. Of course, you could also remove those if you want, just by heading over to the appearance tab of your repeating group. But for the time being, that concludes everything I wanted to cover within this section of our tutorial. So we're going to jump back into our Notion checklist. And back over in Notion, I'm going to tick off that we've finished building out the Trello dashboard page, which of course is going to be the main home page of our application today. And throughout that, we not only covered how we could actually build out the elements that we display on the page, but of course how we could also create our fully functional navigation menu. Moving down our list of features in my Notion checklist, the next thing I want to focus on is building out the workflow and experience to create a new Trello board. Now, thankfully, there isn't too much involved in this whole process. So let's just jump over into our bubble editor and I can start walking you through it. So over on my index page here, our overall home page for our Trello clone, you may remember that we've added a reusable element, which is our header navigation menu. So if we ever wanted to make changes to that reusable element, we need to do so within that section of our application editor. And the reason I talk about this is because inside of our reusable element, we have the create button, which of course, when that is clicked, we're going to want to create a new Trello board within our application. So if we want to build out our feature, we're going to need to open up our page drop-down menu here and head over to our reusable header menu. Then from here, of course, we can select any elements and make changes to anything inside of this. And so when it comes to the experience I want to create today, I want to build out a workflow that runs whenever someone clicks on this button, in which case I'd like to display a menu below this, which would allow someone to add in both a background image as well as a title for a Trello board. And of course, when they click another button to create that board, I'm going to want to create that in my database and then redirect a user through to that Trello board so they can start making changes to it. And so in order to create this little drop down menu, we're going to scroll on down to our containers menu, and we're not going to use just a standard group element. Instead, we're going to use what's known as a focus group. So a focus group functions like a group, only it will be linked to another visual element on your page, which determines where it will actually be positioned. And so if I was to add a focus group anywhere on my page, the first thing you'll notice is that it automatically positions in the top left-hand corner. And the reason for this is because if I jump over to my appearance tab, your focus group requires you to add a reference element. And so if I was to set the reference element as our create button, what you'll now see is that this focus group is pinned to this element. So that means when we choose to display this group, it will be in the exact position we want. And that's another thing I should mention about focus groups is that they are hidden by default. They'll only be displayed whenever you call them within a workflow. And of course, we're going to create that workflow in a moment. But the first thing I'd like to do is just update the name of this focus group. I'm going to call this group focus create board. From here, I'm also going to head down to the offset top field and I'm going to add in 10 pixels of offset, which just means that it's going to have 10 pixels of space between our button as well as the focus group. Then while we're working in our appearance tab, I'm going to remove the style of this because I'd like to set the roundness of its borders to be 10. So that way it has some nice curved edges there. And then finally, I can jump over to my layout tab. Now, when it comes to the container layout of this group, I'd like to stack elements from top to bottom, so vertically, which of course means I'm going to need to set the container layout to be a column. And while we're here, I'm also going to update the width settings of this focus group. So if I was to unselect that this should be a fixed width, what you'll see is that because this has a maximum width, it's going to stretch out and take up as much space as it possibly can on our page. And that's actually not the experience I want to create today. Instead, what I'd like to do is set the minimum width to be 0, but I was actually quite happy with the maximum width it had before of 280 pixels. So I'm going to set the max width to be 280, which just means that at its largest possible size, it will be no greater than this width here. I will of course come back and update the height settings in a moment. But the first thing I'd like to do is add in all of the elements which will allow someone to actually create a Trello board. And the first element I'd like to add in is just going to be a text element, which is going to act like a heading. So I'm going to scroll on up to my visual elements. I'll add a text element inside of my focus group, and I'll have this display the words create a board. I will then jump on down to the styling of this text element and remove this style because I'd like to make a few small changes here. I'm going to first of all set the font size to be 16. I will center align the text within the text element itself. And I will also update the color of this font to be a light shade of gray. If you'd like to use the same color code as me, it's 565B6A. I'm then going to jump over to our layout tab because of course I'll need to make this text element fully responsive. So like always when it comes to text elements, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. I'll also set the minimum height to be 0. And of course, because we have the default option selected to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, it's going to collapse nicely around the text there. And from here, I'll also add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the left and 10 on the right, just to ensure this text element doesn't touch the borders of the actual focus group itself. Then below this text element, I'm going to add in yet another. So I'm going to head to my visual elements once again. I'll add another text element, and I'm going to have this element display the word background. Then from here, I'm going to remove the style of this element because I'd like to bold this text here. I'm also going to update the color of this. I'm going to add in a custom color code for a shade of black. If you'd like that, it's 353942. I'll then jump over into my layout tab because of course, once again, I want to make this text element fully responsive. So similar to before, I will unselect that this should be a fixed width, set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite, and I'll be setting the minimum height to 0. There'll be no difference in changes between these two elements. The only thing I would like to make different is just the margins around this element. So I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And then below this text element, what I'd like to do is add in a picture uploader, which of course is going to allow someone to upload a custom background image to this Trello board. So I'm going to scroll on down to my input forms and I'm going to add in a picture uploader element. The first thing I'll do is update the name of this. I'm going to call this picture uploader board background. Then before I update any of the height and width settings, I'm going to jump over to my appearance tab, remove the style of this because I just like to scroll on down to the borders of this picture uploader, and I'm going to set the roundness of its borders to be 10. I'll then jump back over into my layout tab because of course I want to make this fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So that way it's going to take up as little or as much space as it can inside of my focus group. For the margins on the sides of this picture uploader though, I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 on the right, just to ensure it doesn't touch the borders of the group it lies within. And then when it comes to the height, I'm going to set this to be 120 pixels. And I would like to keep that at a fixed height because if I do that, it's going to keep this landscape dimension here, which will keep a relevant aspect ratio for the background image that someone uploads. Now, the other field I'd like to store when we create a Trello board is just going to be the title of the board. So I'm going to make a copy of this text element. I'm going to move this to the next position, and I'm going to head over to my appearance tab and update this text to display the words board title. Below this, I'd then like to add in a regular input field. So I'm going to head to my input forms. I'll add in an input field. And the first thing I'll do is update the name of this. I'm going to call this input board name. Then while we're working on this input field, I'm just going to remove the style of this because I'd like to update the roundness of its borders to be 10, so that way it matches the same curvature as the picture uploader above it there. I'll jump over to my layout tab. I'm going to make this element fully responsive, which means of course I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And then when it comes to the height, I'm going to leave this as a fixed value, but I'm just going to set that at 45 pixels. Again, 45 pixels is just a particular height that I like to use. There's nothing wrong if you leave it at 48 pixels. I will just add in 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 on the right, so that way it sits in line with the picture uploader element above it there. And the very last element I'd like to add into our focus group is just going to be a button, which when clicked will run a workflow and create a new Trello board. So I'm going to scroll on up to my visual elements. I'll add a button element into my group. I'll update the text within this button to display the word create. I'll then jump over into my layout tab because I'd like to make this the last element within my focus group. Then I'm also going to make this element fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width as 0, of course, leaving the maximum width as infinite. Then for the height, just a personal preference of mine is that I want to make this button slightly slimmer. So I'm going to set the minimum height to be 40. I'll then jump on down to my margins and just add in 20 pixels of margin around every single border within this button. So that way it is no longer touching the borders of my focus group itself. And that is everything I'd actually like to add into this focus group. So what I'd like to do before we build out our workflow to actually create a new Trello board is build out the workflow that's going to display this focus group. So as I mentioned before, focus groups are hidden by default. They'll only be displayed whenever you choose to show them on your page. And of course, I only want to show this focus group whenever someone clicks on this create button. So what I'm going to do is select on this create button here. I'll jump to our appearance tab and I'll choose to start a workflow whenever a user clicks on this button. Then within this workflow, it's a relatively straightforward process. I'm just going to type in the word toggle, and this will allow me to toggle an element. And what Bubble means by toggling is that it's either just going to hide or display an element based on if it's currently visible. So for the element, this of course is going to be my focus group. So I'm just going to type in the word focus and I'll select from my group focus element. And that's all I'll need to change for this particular workflow. Because this is related to my experience of creating a new Trello board, what I might do is just click on the workflow trigger and update the event color to be blue. So that way I can easily differentiate between the existing workflows within this header menu. I'll then jump back to my design tab. I'll click on my create button here. And now we're going to build out the workflow that runs whenever someone wants to actually create a new Trello board. So I'm going to select to start a workflow. And within this workflow, we're going to want to add a couple of different steps. The first thing I'd like to do is, of course, create a new Trello board in my database. So what we're going to do is we're going to head to our data tab and we're going to choose to create a brand new thing. The type of thing we'd like to create is going to be a Trello board. And then what we'll need to do is match all of the relevant fields in our database with all of the relevant information on our page. So first of all, we're going to mark the featured image of this Trello board. In this case, this is going to, of course, be the value stored in our picture upload element. Then I'm going to store the title for this Trello board, which of course will be the value stored in our input board name. It's nice and simple. But the very last thing I'd like to do is just reference the members of this Trello board, which of course is a list of users. I'd like to make sure I add to that list of members the current user. So that is the person who is creating this board. Now, one thing I should also point out is that whenever you create something in your database, Bubble will automatically link the person who created that to that thing. So we don't need to store who the creator of this Trello board is. Bubble's going to do that by default for us. So that just saves us having to store that information in this workflow step. Once we've finished creating a Trello board though, what I would like to do is redirect someone through to a dedicated page in our app where we can actually display that Trello board. And so what we're going to do is add an additional step within this workflow. We're going to select from the navigation action and choose the go to page event, and the destination page at this point in time does not yet exist. So I'm going to create a brand new page from scratch. And I'm going to call this the board page because this is where we're going to display a Trello board. And now before I set that as my destination page, there's one important thing I really want to take the time to explain to you. So if I was to open up my page drop-down menu and open up the new board page that we've just created, at this point in time, this page is of course blank. There's nothing on it. We haven't done anything to it. Now within our app today, what we need to understand is that users are going to create hundreds or potentially thousands of Trello boards. And so for every board that's created, you obviously want to showcase that on a dedicated page. But of course, instead of having to create hundreds or thousands of dedicated pages in your app for each Trello board, this is where you'll really start to see the power of Bubble come to life. What you can do is create one board page. And then if we take the time to update the type of content we store on this page. So I could say on this page, we are going to display the information of a Trello board. What you can do in Bubble is actually choose to send the data of a specific Trello board to this page. And then Bubble will know to display that Trello board's information at that given point in time. So you can have thousands of users looking at thousands of different Trello boards on one single page. So you don't need to go creating thousands of pages, you only need to create one, and then you can easily create a truly dynamic experience for each user that uses your application. And by using the word dynamic, what I mean is that everyone is going to have a unique experience of their own. So after I've set the type of content on this page to be a board, please make sure you've done that. That's very important. I'm going to jump back over to my header menu, to my reusable element. I'll open up my workflow menu where I had just created my Trello board, and now I'm sending a user through to a page. What I'm going to do is set the destination page to be my board page. And what you'll notice now is that because we have a type of content stored on that page to be a Trello board, Bubble needs to know which specific Trello board you'd like to show on that page. And so in this case, I need to send data through to that page. And the data I'd like to send through is going to be the Trello board that someone's created in step 1 of our workflow. So I'm just going to select that the board I'd like to send is the result of step 1, where we've just created a new Trello board. And because this workflow is related to our board creation process, I'm going to select on the workflow trigger. I'll update its event color to be blue, so that way I can easily differentiate between the existing workflows. And that is actually everything we'll need to add when it comes to the process of creating a Trello board. There's one additional thing we might like to do at this point in time, and that is jump over to our index page. And of course, on this page, we're displaying a list of all of the Trello boards that someone has created, as well as the Trello boards that someone is a member of. And it's at this point that I'd just like to click on the blue group, which displays the background image of a Trello board. And I want to create an experience that redirects someone through to a dedicated board page whenever someone clicks on this Trello board. So what we're going to do is we're going to choose to start a workflow here. And this is a relatively straightforward process. I'm just going to head to the navigation events, select the go to page action, and I'll set the destination page to be the board page. Only in this case, the data I'd like to send is going to be the current cell's border. So that is the board being displayed in the repeating group cell that someone has just clicked. It truly is as simple as that. And that is everything I would like to cover at this point. What I'd like to do is run a preview of my application and show you how this is going to function, creating a Trello board of our own within our account. And so to save me having to log in as an existing user, what I'm going to do is instead of running a direct preview, I'm going to jump over to my data tab. And if I head to my app data tab here, I can select on my all users option, and it's going to display a list of all of the users who have registered an account within my database. And then what I can do is choose to log in as this user by selecting the run as option. And it's going to run a preview as me logged in as my Lachlan Kirkwood account. So if I select this, it's going to open up my preview. And then of course, over on our index page, there's currently no data being displayed within our repeating groups. You can see we've got these two great lines here. That of course is the borders of my repeating groups. But what I'd like to do is select the create button, and I want to toggle my focus group, which at this point in time, I could just see that my focus group is actually covering my button. And this is actually a common thing I've noticed when I work with focus groups inside of Bubble, is that I actually need to add some additional offset space, just because when I run a preview version of my app, it seems to break the formatting. So what I'm going to do is just quickly jump back into my Bubble editor, open up my page dropdown, and head to my header menu. I'm then going to need to display my focus group. And of course, because the focus group is hidden by default, you're not going to be able to see it on your page. But if you'd like to open up your focus group, you can head over to your elements tree here, open this menu, and it's going to display a list of all of the elements on your page. And if you tick this option to only show the hidden elements, you'll see your focus group, from which you can select on this, and it is going to now display this on your page. And within this focus group, I'm just going to change the top offset to not be 10, but instead be 30. Then if I jump over to my Bubble preview and refresh the page here, I'm going to select on my button once again, and now you'll see the formatting is looking much better. When I'm creating a new Trello board, I'm just going to take the time to upload a custom background image. So I'm going to select on this. Then after uploading a custom background image, I'm going to add in a title. I'm going to call this product roadmap. I'll then choose to create my Trello board. That workflow is going to run, and it's going to redirect us through to our board page, which at this point in time, this page is blank. But one thing I should point out is that if you look in your URL string here, you may notice there's a long string of characters that have been sent through to this particular page. And that string of characters is actually the unique ID for the Trello board that you'd like to display on this page. And so that's how Bubble can reference which Trello board to show at any given time. Another thing I just like like to point out though is that if I jump back to my home page here, what you'll notice is that we now have our first Trello board being displayed within our repeating group. And of course, if I wanted to click on this Trello board, it's going to redirect me back through to our dedicated board page, and once again send with it the unique ID for Bubble to display the information of that Trello board. Jumping back into my Notion checklist, I'm going to tick off that we finished building out the feature to create a new Trello board, which of course is an essential feature for our entire application today, as it's going to lay down the framework for how we can now build out our actual board page, where we are going to display the full information of a Trello board and allow users to easily customize the information on that board. Moving my way down through our list of features in my Notion checklist, the next thing we're going to focus on is, in my opinion, one of the more complex things of our overall build today, and that is starting to put together our dynamic board page. So this is of course the page where users are going to interact with the Trello board. They're going to be able to create lists, create tasks, and of course move those all between each other. Now, for the sake of our tutorial, I have taken the time to break this down into as many different sections as possible. I really don't want to overwhelm you just by bombarding you with information straight off the bat. Instead, I want to break everything into more bite-sized pieces, because when you look at the overall Trello application, so here's an example of a Trello board here, there's actually quite a lot happening. Not only do you have the ability to move lists around, but you obviously have the ability to move tasks around. And of course, on top of that, you can not only create new lists, but also create new tasks. And when you build this inside a Bubble, it's actually a pretty complex thing to bring to life. But of course, I'm here today to make your life as simple as possible. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up our Bubble editor. And of course, we're going to head over to our page drop-down menu and open the dynamic board page that we had previously created. And now at this point in time, this page should be blank. The only change we've made to it is we've updated the type of content that we're storing on this page. So I've set this to be a board because we're going to be sending the data of a specific Trello board to this page. Now, before I update any of the layout settings, the first thing I'd like to do is update the background style. So at this point in time, by default, the background is a flat color, which is white. Now, typically what I would do is I would set the background color to be a light shade of gray, just so I could see where it sits within my overall Bubble editor. But what I'm going to actually do here is set the background style to be an image, because of course from our previous module, we've allowed users to upload a custom background image. And so for the data source of this image, I'm going to insert dynamic data within the dynamic image field, and I'm going to have this display the current page board. Now, what Bubble means by the current page board is that, remember how we were sending the information of a specific Trello board to this page? Bubble's now going to refer to that as the current page board. So the board currently being displayed on our page. So I'm going to reference the current page board, its featured image. And like with any other image elements, I'm going to choose the more option and select to process this image with Imgix, just so I can resize the dimensions by cropping them. I'll then close this. Now, of course, if a user hasn't taken the time to upload a custom background image, what I'd like to do is add a default color that's going to take its place whenever this image is not available. And the color within our application today is just going to be the same shade of blue I've been using throughout my app. So if you'd like this color code again, it's 007AC0. Now that's all I'll need to change within my appearance tab for our overall page. What I would like to do though is jump into our layout tab. And of course, I'm going to need to set the container layout of this page. Now, when it comes to any page, as I've mentioned in the past, in almost all use cases for pages, I set the container layout to be a column because we're going to be stacking elements from the top down to the bottom. So I'm going to select the column option here. And now we can start adding the elements onto our page, and this is where things are about to get real. So the first element I'm going to add onto this page is thankfully relatively straightforward. It's just going to be our header menu, which of course we've already taken the time to build that as a reusable element. So we can easily just drag a version of that onto our page. So I'm just going to move my header out of the way here. I'm going to scroll on down to our reusable elements, and I'm going to add that header menu onto our page. Nice and straightforward. Then if I was to look at the real world Trello product, what you'll see is that below our header menu, we have almost like this sub menu for each Trello board. So it just displays the name of the Trello board as well as a couple of different settings. So the ability to share a board as well as the ability to open up the settings menu for this board. And so what I'm going to do is add another group onto my page and try and replicate this experience. So if I jump back into my Bubble editor, I'm going to head on up to my containers menu, and I'm going to select to add a group below below my reusable element. Now, before we make any changes to this group, I'm going to jump to my appearance tab and I'm just going to remove the style of this. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'd like to give it a flat background color. And I might make that, let's say, a light shade of pink, just so I can actually see where this group sits on my page. Now, by all means, when you go to publish or preview your application, you can just remove this background style and then it'll just be transparent so you can see the actual page below it. However, while we're building our application, it's going to be essential to try and color code your elements so that way you can actually see where everything sits on your page. We're about to add a lot of elements onto the page, so you'll easily get lost if you don't color code everything along the way. But when it comes to this group, I'm then going to jump to my layout tab and I'm going to need to update the container layout for this group. And of course, if we were to look at the real world Trello product once again, you can see that all of the elements inside of this group are stacked side by side, so horizontally, which means we're going to have to set the container layout to be a row. I'm then going to make this element fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So this group is now going to take up as little or as much space as it possibly can across the width of our page. I will come back in a moment and update the height settings, but before I do that, I'm going to need to add all of the elements I want inside of this group. Now, the first element I'd like to add in is just going to be the name of this Trello board. So I'm going to scroll on up to my visual elements and I'm going to grab a text element. I'll add this into my group. I'll then choose to insert dynamic data and I'd like to display the name of the Trello board being displayed on our page. So I'm going to reference the current page board. So that's the Trello board that someone's viewing on this page. Its title. That's relatively straightforward. I'm then going to choose to remove the style of this because I'd like to update the font size to be 20. I'll then also bold the font as well as update the font color to be white. I'll jump over to my layout tab because I'll now need to make this element fully responsive. I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width here to be 0. I'm also then going to set the minimum height to be 0, and that's going to collapse nicely around this text element. Then from here, I'm also going to vertically align this text element in the center of my pink group. Now, I will be coming back in a moment to update a few additional settings, but the next thing I'd like to add onto our page is just going to be a series of buttons, which allows someone to share this Trello board, as well as then also open up the settings for this Trello board. And when it comes to these buttons, I'm going to want to display these on the right-hand side. So similar to our reusable header menu, what I'm going to do is add a group on our page, and I'm going to have that be positioned to the right-hand side of our pink group. So I'll be adding a group within our existing group. So if I scroll on down to my containers menu, I'm going to add another group inside of my pink group. Now, before I make any changes to the layout settings of this group, I'm going to jump over to my appearance tab because I'd like to update the color of this group so I can actually see where it sits in my page. I will remove the style of this. I'll set a flat background color and I might make this a shade of green. So now it looks similar to the existing group within my header navigation menu, but of course I can easily see where it sits inside of my pink group. I'm then going to jump over to my layout tab. And when it comes to this group, I'm going to place 2 buttons directly beside each other. So that means I'm going to be stacking them horizontally, which of course means once again, I'm going to set this container layout to be a row. And I'm going to come back and update all of the width and height settings in a moment. But first of all, I'm just going to add the elements I want to actually display inside of this group. And the first element is just going to be a custom button, which when clicked will allow someone to share access to this Trello board. So if I open up the Trello application, what you'll see is we have this share button here with a little icon element, as well as some text. Now in Bubble, unfortunately, when it comes to button elements, you can't actually add icons into them, but that doesn't mean your boy here doesn't have a workaround for that. You might not know this, but what you can actually do in Bubble is create a custom button of your own using a group. And so I'm going to head over to our containers menu and add yet another group inside of my existing green group. And now before I make any changes to this group, I'm going to jump over to my appearance tab and just update the background color of this. I'm going to set it to be a flat color and I'm going to leave this as white. While we're here, I'm also going to set the roundness of this group's borders to be 10. So that way it has some curved edges. I'll then jump to my layout tab and inside of this group, I'm going to display 2 elements side by side. So there's going to be an icon as well as some text. So that means I'm going to set the container layout to be a row because I'll be stacking these horizontally. So from here, I'm going to add the icon element in first. So if I head to my visual elements, I'll add an icon element into my group. And I'm just going to search for an icon known as a user. and then you'll see the little user icon with a plus symbol next to it. I'll select that. Then when it comes to the style of this icon, I'm going to remove the default style because I'd like to make this a custom color. I'm going to paste in a color code I have here, and if you'd like that, it's 4C4C53. I'm then going to jump over to my layout tab because I'd like to customize the dimensions as well as the positioning of this icon. Now, I'm actually quite happy with the dimensions, to be honest, at 30 by 30. Now, both of these are a fixed width and height. So that means that at any given time, the icon is going to be this exact size here. I would just like to vertically align this icon in the center of my white group. And then I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom, 10 on the left, but none on the right. Then beside this icon, I'm going to add in a text element, which is just going to display the word share. So I'll head to my visual elements. I'll grab a text element and add that into my white group. I'll update this text to display the word share, as I just mentioned. Then when it comes to this text, I'm going to remove the style of this because I'm going to bold this text as well as update the color of this. I'm going to have this be the exact same color code as our icon element. So if you'd like that, once again, it's 4C4C53. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab because I'll need to make this element fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. Then I'm also going to update the minimum height to be 0, which of course means it's going to collapse nicely around our text element. And then finally, I'm going to vertically align this in the center of my white group, and I'll just add in some margins around the borders of this text element. So I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom. I'll only add in 5 on the left, but then also 10 on the right. And now that I've finished adding both of my elements inside of this white group, which is going to become my button, I'm going to select on the white group itself. And when it comes to the width of this group, I'm going to update this, but I am going to keep this as a fixed width because I'm only ever going to want this button to be the same consistent size. And so I'm going to set the width of this button to be 100 pixels. And the reason why I've selected 100 pixels is because that is enough to fit both of my elements inside of this button. For the height though, I'm going to set the minimum height to be 0, and that means it's going to collapse nicely around all of the elements inside of it. Finally, I'm then going to vertically align this button in the center of my green group, and now you can really start to see that this is coming to life. Beside this button though, I'd like to add another, and that's just going to be a button that includes the 3 dots, or it's also known as the kebab menu, because it definitely does look like a kebab. And so what I'm going to need to do is add in yet another group inside of my existing green group, because I'm going to need to create yet another custom button. So if I head to my containers menu once again, I'll add another group beside our existing one. The first thing I'll do is jump over to my appearance tab. I will remove the style of this group. I'll set the background style to be a flat color, and I'll leave that as white. I'll then update the roundness of its borders to be 10. I can jump into my layout tab. Now, when it comes to the container layout of this group, I'm only adding one element into this, and that's just going to be my little icon like the kebab menu. So if we look at the real world Trello product, you can see there's just this small little square group with a little 3-dot kebab in it. So I'm going to jump back into Bubble here. And so for the container layout, it doesn't really matter what I select it to be. I personally will select it to be a row though, just because it's going to allow me to align this in the center of the group. But I'll come back to that setting in a moment. The first thing I want to do is actually add the icon into this group. And in order to streamline that whole process, I'm just going to select on the very first icon I added. So the icon with the user with the plus symbol. I'm going to make a copy of that, then select in my second group and choose to paste this in. And then I'm going to jump into my appearance tab, and I'm going to open up my icon menu. And if I just scroll on up to the top here, I can then scroll on down a little bit and you'll see the kebab menu. We'll select that. Now we won't need to make any changes to the color of this. We will jump over to the layout tab. And although I'm quite happy with the dimensions as they are, so 30 pixels in width by 30 pixels in height, the only change I'd just like to make is that I want to add a right margin to this icon, because this will be the only icon within my group. So it's not like I'm going to display some text to the right hand side of it. I'm then going to select on the overall white group here, and I'm going to head to my container layout settings, and this is where I'm going to horizontally center this icon in the middle of this group. And because that is everything I want to add into this group, I'm then going to update the width and height settings. Now, unlike our first group, I'm not going to need to make that a fixed width. Instead, what I'm going to do is unselect that this group should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width as 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. And as you can see, we've got all this empty space on both sides of our icon. So what I'm also going to do is select this option to fit fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. And because our icon has a margin of 10 around every single border, it's just going to leave a nice bit of space between the icon and the group itself. I'll then click back on my group because I'll need to do the same thing for our height. So I'm going to set the minimum height to be 0, which means it's now going to collapse vertically around the icon. Finally, I can then vertically align our white group in the center of our green group. And then the last thing I'll need to do is just add in some margins around this group so that way it doesn't touch our existing button as well as the border of my green group. So I'm just going to add in 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 pixels of margin on the right. And because that's everything I want to add into our overall green group here, we can now select on our green group and we can jump to our layout tab. And this is where we can now update the responsive settings of this group. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width as 0, but when it comes to the maximum width, what you'll now see is that because this group has a maximum width of infinite, it's going to take up as much space as it possibly can within our overall pink group. And that's not the experience we want to create. Instead, we only want this green group to take up as much space as it needs to fit these two buttons, which means that I can select this option to fit the width of this group to the content inside of it. And it's going to collapse nicely around my buttons. I will then of course update the height here. I'm going to set the minimum height to be 0, and I will vertically align this group in the center of our pink group. And after saying the word group 1,000 different times, just like that, we have finished adding not only our custom green group, our custom button groups, and now it's time to wrap up the actual custom pink group that we have to store all of these elements inside of it. So I'm going to click on the pink group here. I'll just move my property editor to the side. I'm going to scroll on down and update the minimum height to now be 0. And what you'll see is that this is going to collapse nicely around all of my elements here. But we're not quite done yet. What I would also like to do is make this group fully responsive. So if I was to open up my responsive menu here, what you'll see is that these elements are slightly responsive at this point in time. But I just worry that if my page is to collapse, you'll see that the text here gets pushed down on 2 separate lines. Whereas I would always like this text to just have its own independent line. And so what I can actually do is select on my text element. And the first thing I should point out is that right now our text element is touching the border of my page, whereas I just want to give it some space to push it over to the right hand side. So if I just head over to my property editor and open up the layout tab for this text element, what I could do is give it 20 pixels of margin on the left and also 20 pixels of margin on the right. And now if this element has 20 pixels of margin on each side, and if we remember that at the smallest possible mobile device size, our page could be 320 pixels. What I could actually do is set a minimum width of 280 pixels. So that means 280 plus 20 plus 20, of course, equals 320. So that now means that when this page starts to collapse and this element has less than 280 pixels, it's going to have its own independent line, which is the exact experience I want to create. But the other thing I should point out is that right now it's touching the borders of the existing header menu above it, as well as the elements below it. So I'm also just going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top and 20 pixels of margin on the bottom. So even when our page is scaled out, it's going to look quite nice. And then when we collapse this menu, all of our buttons are going to be positioned below this. But the other thing I should point out now is that our button elements are going to be positioned directly on the border of our page. And so it might be helpful to click on our green group and just add in some margin on the left-hand side of it. Or if I wanted to keep things consistent, I could actually click on the white group. So the group that is my share button, because if you remember, we've already added some margin around our existing button here, which contains our kebab icon. So I could select on my share button group and just add in 20 pixels of margin on the left. And of course, when you preview or publish your app, and if you were to remove the flat background color, this button's going to look like it is exactly in line with the text element above it there. So that's a perfect experience there. And so now this group is fully responsive regardless of the page size, which then concludes everything I wanted to add into this section of our page. And from here, it's time to get into the meat of the actual Trello board page. And this is where things might start to get a little bit complex. But of course, I'm going to try and explain things in as much detail as I can along the way. And so before we build anything out, I just want to open up a real world version of Trello once again and just talk about the layout for all of the lists and cards here. And so obviously below this menu that we've just created, we have this long string of lists here, which are all of the independent columns inside of a Trello board. And these can continually scroll horizontally. And then at the far side, you'll see the option to add another list So you can add another column into the existing structure. And of course, within each of these lists, you can drag these and rearrange these inside of your Trello board. And of course, that is an experience we're going to create today. But the first thing I want to do is just teach you how we can actually structure the overall lists on our page. And then in a separate module, I'm going to talk about how we can drag these across and reposition them. And so if we jump back into Bubble, what I'm going to do first is add a group element onto my page. And I'm going to set the container layout of that group to be a row. And the reason I'm doing that is because if I was to just quickly jump back into Trello once again, the way I vision this page being built is that they obviously have a repeating group of lists here. So they're pulling out a whole lot of lists within a database, which are stored within this one Trello board. And then beside this, they almost have like this additional group, which is kind of like a button. And that's always going to sit to the right-hand side. And in my mind, this actually sits horizontally beside our repeating group. So if I was to look at this overall page, I'm going to break this down into two separate sections. So on the left-hand side of our main group, we have our repeating group. And on the right-hand side, we just have this simple button. And so that's something we're going to create today. So if we jump over into our Bubble editor, I'm going to scroll on down to my containers menu, and I'm going to add a group element onto my page. Now, when it comes to this group element, the first thing I'm going to do is just remove the style of this and give this a flat background color. And this is of course so we can see where this overall group lies on our page. I'm going to set the background color to be a shade of orange. So that way I can clearly depict that this is my overall group that's going to house my repeating group. I'll then jump over into my layout tab. And as I mentioned, I'm going to set the container layout to be a row because I'll be stacking two elements beside each other. There's our repeating group, and then there's our little button which allows someone to add a new list. I'm of course going to want to make this element fully responsive, so I will unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite, so that way it can take up as little or as much space as it needs on my page. And now from here, I'm going to add in the very first element inside of our orange group, and that is going to be the repeating group itself. So if I head to my containers menu, I'm going to add a repeating group element into my orange group. And the first thing I'll need to do with any repeating group is of course configure the data source. So I'm going to update the type of content I'd like to display to be a list of lists. So within our Trello board, we're going to now display our lists. And then when it comes to the data source, what I'd like to do is perform a search in my database for all of the lists where the original board that these lists belong to equals the same board as the current page board that someone is viewing on our page. And what I'm also going to do is update this sort by field. So I'm going to want these lists to appear in some sort of order. Now, if you remember, in our database, under our list data type, we also had an additional data field known as the position number. And this was stored as a number. So that's going to determine in which order our list should be displayed. And so what I'm going to do is display these in chronological order. So position number 1 will be the first list, number 2 will be the second, and so on. And so if I jump back into my design tab, I'm going to open up my data source and sort these by their position number. And if I set the descending value to be no, it's just going to display those in chronological order. And that's all I'll need to configure for my data source. So I'm going to close that. The next thing I'll need to do is update the number of rows and columns that I have. And when it comes to our Trello board, what I can see is that there is actually an infinite number of columns. So each of these is known as a column. However, I can see there's only one row of all of these items. So we can replicate that within our own repeating group. So I'm going to set the number of rows here to be 1. However, when it comes to the number of columns, I'm going to unselect that should be a fixed number. And I'm also going to update the minimum width of each column to be 320 pixels. And the reason why I've selected 320 pixels is because at the smallest possible mobile device size, which is 320 pixels, I want to display one column at a time. And then of course, if a user wants to view more columns, they can just slide across and view the rest of those. But I'm going to set this to be 320 pixels. Now, while we're working on our repeating group, I'm also going to remove the style of this, and I'm going to give it a background color. And I'm going to make this a shade of bright yellow, so that way I can see where this sits. Now, obviously our app is starting to look like one big giant ice cream cake, but you definitely can't argue with me that things aren't legible, because right now we can clearly see where all of our elements lie on our page. But now from here, what I'd also like to do is just jump over into my layout settings. And something I should point out is that although you can only see one cell of our repeating group, it is going to display more. So let's say you've got 5 lists within a Trello board. This is going to display 5 columns across your page, not just the one. Now, when it comes to the container layout for each cell in our repeating group, I'm going to be stacking elements from top to bottom. So they're going to be vertical, which means the container layout will need to be a column. I'm then going to update the width settings. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. And of course, what you'll now see is that our repeating group is scaled across the full width of our group on our page. So this is what it's going to look like. We're going to have all of these different lists. I'm also then just going to make sure I set the minimum width of our repeating group to be 320 pixels. So that way, once again, it matches the same width we've just set in our appearance tab here of 320. I'll come back in a moment and update the height, but now this is where things are really going to start to get interesting, because I'd like to actually add the elements that are going to display the lists in our repeating group. But unfortunately, it's not as straightforward as just adding a group into our repeating group cell. And the reason for that is because, like the real world Trello experience, I want to be able to grab these lists and move them across and update the position of where they sit. So when I look at Trello's real world product here, what I essentially see is this gray box. That is essentially just one big group. And inside of this group, it obviously displays the name of the list, and it has another repeating group inside of it, which would display a list of cards. So in theory, you could just add a big group in here, and as I mentioned, add another repeating group inside of that. But because we want to create the experience today where we can drag and drop lists wherever we want inside of our Trello board, it's going to be a little bit more complex to create that experience. And the reason for that is because we're going to have to install a plugin that allows us to bring that functionality to life. Now, thankfully, this is a free plugin. So we're going to jump over into our bubble editor. We're going to open up our plugins tab, and we're going to choose to add a new plugin. And the plugin you'll be searching for is known as draggable elements. So if you just type in the word drag, you'll be able to see this plugin, which is built by Bubble. We're going to install this into our application. I'll then close my plugin library and jump back into my design tab. And now after we've installed this plugin, you'll see two additional elements within your containers menu. So for your draggable elements, you essentially have what's known as a drop area, and then also what's known as a drag group. And the best way to illustrate that is actually within Trello's real world product. So if I was to grab this group here, this gray container that is my list, that is known as the drag area, because of course I can drag this around. But then what you'll see is that as I move this into the position of an existing list, this dark area that's highlighted is known as my drop area. So that's my drop zone. And that just indicates where I can actually drop this Trello list. So I can switch these around. And within our plugin, we have the exact same options. So we have our drop area, and then we have our drag group. So the first thing we'll need to do before we add in our lists is actually add in the drop area that's going to sit behind it, which allows us to then drag our lists across each other. So I'm going to select to add a drop area element into my repeating group. And the first thing I'll be doing is just taking the time to update the name of this. I'm going to call this the drop area list. And because this element sits inside of my repeating group, I'm going to have this fetch the data of the cell in my repeating group. So that way, when I add any additional elements into this group, I can easily just reference that data. So for the type of content, I'd like this to be a list. And for the data source, it's relatively straightforward. I'm just going to pull the data from the current cells list that it sits within. Then after configuring that data source, what I'm personally going to do is just update the background color. I'm actually just going to make that a darker shade of gray. Now this isn't completely necessary, but I just want to make this group as legible as possible on my page. So I just want to be able to clearly see where this sits. Of course, when you go to preview or publish your app though, you can set the background style to be none. So that way it doesn't have a color. I should also point out that this drop area will have a condition on it by default, which just updates the color of this whenever someone drags an element on top of it. So if you toggle this on and off, you'll see what the actual color is when someone drags a list over the top of it. I will just jump over into my layout tab though, because what I'd like to do is just update the container layout of this. Now inside of this drop area, I'm going to be stacking elements vertically. So I'm going to set the container layout to be a column. I'm then going to want this drop area to take up the full width of my repeating group cell. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width to be infinite. I'll come back and update the height in a moment. But while I'm here, I'm also just going to add a margin of 20 pixels at the bottom. And that's just because when I close off the empty space of my repeating group, I just want to keep a nice border below this. So I'm just going to add in 20 pixels. And that's everything we'll need to change for our drop area for the time being. From here though, what we can now do is add in the actual drag area group, which is going to form the list itself. So if I jump back into Bubble, head to our containers menu, what I'm going to do is add in a drag drop group. So I'm going to add this inside of my droppable group, and I'm going to update the name of this to be called drag drop group list, so I can tell that this is related to my list feature. I'm then going to jump to my appearance tab, and the first thing I'm going to do is tick this option to make this element droppable, which just means that I can drag and drop it onto any drop zone area. And I'm also going to update the behavior post drop. So this just means that if someone drags this onto an area and drops it where it shouldn't be placed, this is going to be the behavior that happens. So if someone drops a group where it shouldn't be placed, I'm just going to move it back to its original position. It's nice and straightforward. I'm also then just going to set a data source in this group because I'm going to be displaying the information of the list from our repeating group cell. So for this type of content, I'm going to set this to be a list. And for the data source, I'm going to have this pull data from the parent groups list. Now the parent group is of course the drop zone that this element sits within, and the drop zone sits within our repeating group. So we're passing the data on through the chain of elements. I'm going to then update the background style to be a flat color. Then from here, I'm going to set the roundness of this element's borders to be 10. So that way it has some curved edges. And that is all I'll need to change within our appearance tab. So I'm going to jump over into our layout tab because I'll now need to make this element fully responsive. The first thing I'll do is update the container layout. Now, once again, I'm going to be stacking elements in this from top to bottom, so vertically, which means I'm going to need to set the container layout to be a column. When it comes to the width of this element, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. Now, for the minimum width, I'm actually going to set this at 300 pixels. And the reason I'm doing that is because around the margins of this group, I'm going to add in 10 pixels on each side, which just means that this group will never touch the borders of my drop zone. And of course, if I have 300 pixels in minimum width plus 10 pixels of margin on the left and 10 on the right, that's going to equal 320 pixels, which is the smallest possible screen size someone could view my application on. I will, however, keep the maximum width as infinite, which just means that it's going to expand and take up as much space as it possibly can. Then when it comes to the height, I am going to come back and update this to have a minimum height of 0. But before I do that, what I'll need to do is add all of my elements into this group, because if I was to set the minimum height as 0 right now, and because we have this default option selected to fit the height of this element to the content within it, what you'll find is that because there is no content within it, it's just going to collapse and take up no space. So I'm just going to need to add all of my elements into this group before I do that. And when it comes to the elements I want to display within this group, the first thing I'm going to do is display the name of this list. So I'm going to scroll on up to our visual elements. I will grab a text element and add that within my white group. And I will then insert dynamic data and display the parent group's list, the name of that list. Then after adding that in, I'm just going to remove the style of this because I'd like to update the font size to be 18. I'll then choose to bold this text. I'll of course need to make this fully responsive as well. So I'm going to jump over into my layout tab. I'm then going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. Like any text element, I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So now this text element is going to take up as little or as much space as it can within our white group. I'll then also set the minimum height to be 0. And because the option is selected to fit the height of this element to the content within it, it's going to collapse nicely around that text. And then finally for this text element, I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin around each border here, which just ensures that it doesn't touch the outside of my white group. And at this point, you can start to see that our Trello board is slowly coming together, although it doesn't quite look like a real world Trello board at this point in time. What we do have is our repeating group of lists, and of course the framework built for our drag and drop zone areas. And now one thing I should also point out is that at this point in time, our drag and drop feature is not yet functional. There's still a couple of workflows we need to build in order to make that fully functional. So if you were to drag a list and drop it anywhere, it would not stay in its position. It would just move back to its previous spot. But right now, that's everything I want to add into this particular section of our list. What I would like to do is then select on our overall repeating group. So this is our green element down the bottom here. And because I've finished adding in the framework for the elements that are going to sit inside of this, what I'm going to do is head to my layout tab and update the minimum height to now be 0, which means it's going to collapse nicely around all of the elements inside of it. And you may remember that at the bottom of our drop zone, we have the margin of 20 pixels, which is why there's still a little bit of a gap there. And the reason why I have that is because it's going to allow me to just see where my actual repeating group sits on the page. And while we have our layout tab open, I'd also like to make another change to the width of this repeating group. So right now it's taking up all of the space on our page. Whereas what I'd like to do is have this repeating group only take up as much space as it's needed to display the amount of lists that have been created in it. So if a user's only created one list, I'll only want to display one repeating group cell. If they've created two, I'll display two repeating group cells. And so what I'm going to do is select this option to fit the width of this element to the content within it, which means it's just going to collapse around the adequate amount of repeating group cells that need to be displayed. And because we've now collapsed the width of this element, what you'll see is our old friend, which is the overall orange group that our repeating group actually sits within. And that is of course where we're going to be able to add in our button, which allows someone to create a new list. But before we dive into that feature, there's one last thing I'd like to do on my repeating group. So I'm going to select on my green repeating group here. And one thing I should point out is that if a user has created a brand new Trello board, at that point in time, there would be no lists within that board. So I actually don't want this repeating group to be visible on my page. I only want it to become visible once a user has actually created their first list. And so what I'm going to do is actually head over to my conditional tab here, and I'm going to define a new condition. And within this condition, I just like to recognize when this overall board that a user is viewing, when it does not have a list created within it, I'd like to hide this repeating group. So I'm just going to actually perform a search in my database for all of the lists where the original board that they belong to equals the current page board, so the board that someone is currently viewing. And when the count of this search, so when we search through our database, it's going to return a count of how many entries here exist. And so when the count of these is in fact 0, so I'm just going to type in the number 0, which means that no list exists for this board. I'm going to select that this element is visible and not tick that that should be true, which just means that this repeating group is now going to be hidden. What I'd also like to do is just jump back into my layout tab and select this option to collapse this element when it's hidden, which just means that when this repeating group is not being displayed, it's not going to take up any space on our page, which is the exact experience I want to create today. And that wraps up everything I want to touch base on for our repeating group right now. There's still plenty we need to add to it. Obviously, we still need to be able to create tasks, move those tasks around, and even learn how we can actually move our lists around. And don't worry, I'm going to get to that within our tutorial. But the last thing I'd like to do within this section of our module today is just create the button, which, similar to the real world Trello product, allows you to add a new list. So this button here is empty. When someone clicks in this, you can see they can type in this field and then they have this little button to add that list. What we're going to do is replicate a similar experience within our own application today. So on the right hand side here within our orange group, I'm going to add in an input field, and whenever that input field has a value in it, I'm going to display a button. And if we were to actually look at the real world Trello product one more time, what you'll see is that when someone's selected into this input field, there's almost like this group that sits around it that contains this button. So you can see that these two elements are stacked vertically, which means that this group has a container layout, which is a column. So we're going to replicate that real world experience. What we're going to do is jump into Bubble. We're going to scroll on down to our containers menu, and we're going to add a group within our orange group here. And when it comes to this group, the first thing I'm going to do is just update the name of this. I'm going to call this group new list, because this is the group in which we're going to be able to create a new list in our Trello board. Before I update the container layout though, I'm going to jump into my appearance tab, and I'm just going to choose to remove the style of this group, because as you probably guessed, I want to give this a flat background color. And I'm just going to make this a shade of red, so that way I can clearly see where this group sits within my overall orange group. Then from here, I'm going to jump over into my layout tab, and I'm going to update the container layout here to be a column, because as I mentioned, I'm going to be stacking two elements on top of each other. And then when it comes to the width of this group, what I'm going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width as 0, but when it comes to the maximum width, I'm not going to leave this as infinite, because right now it's taking up too much space within my page. So what I'm going to do is give this a maximum width of 300 pixels. And the reason why I've selected 300 pixels is because on each side of this group, I'd like to add in a margin of 10 pixels. So if I was to just go ahead and add in my margins now, I'd like to add 10 pixels of margin around every single border for this group. And if we were to have 300 pixels in width plus 10 pixels of margin on the left and 10 on the right, that's going to equal 320 pixels in total width, which is of course the perfect dimensions for the smallest possible mobile device. So right now you can see that that's going to fit on someone's mobile screen. Now, before I update the height of this group, what I'd like to do is add in the elements I'm going to actually display in this group. And the first element is going to be an input field. So I'm going to head to my input forms here. I'm going to choose to add an input field into this. And when it comes to this input field, I'm just going to update the name of this to be called input new list, because this is where we're going to type in the name of a new list that we want to create. I'm also going to remove the default style of this, because if I scroll on down, I'd like to update the background style to be a flat color, and I want to leave that as white. Then from here, I'm going to scroll back on up to my placeholder field, and I'm going to update the text that's displayed in this field until someone actually clicks in it. And for this text, I'm just going to type in a plus symbol, followed by the words add another list. Then I'll jump over into our layout tab because I'd like to make this element fully responsive. So like always, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. Then for the height, I'm going to update this to be 45 pixels, and I'll leave that as a fixed value because I'm always going to want it to be this particular size. Now, once again, 45 pixels is just a personal preference of mine. If it was at 48, there's no particular reason why that would be wrong. This is just my own design choice, but that's everything we'll need to add for this input field. Below this, what I'd like to do is add a button element, which of course later on we're going to build out a workflow to create a new list whenever that is clicked. So I'm going to scroll on up to our visual elements, and I'll add a button element onto our red group. And this button's going to display the words add list. I'll then jump over into my layout tab because I'd like to update the dimensions of this button. And when it comes to the width of this button, I'm going to set this to be 120 pixels, and I will keep that to be a fixed width because I'm only ever going to want this to be 120 pixels. For the height, I'm also going to update the minimum height to be 40, so that way it just makes the button slightly slimmer. And then finally, I'll add in 10 pixels of margin at the top here. And because that is the last element I'd like to add into this red group, I'm going to select on the group itself. I'll head to my layout tab, and I'll update the minimum height of this group to be 0, which means that it's going to collapse nicely around both of the elements inside of this group. Now, similar to the real world Trello product, I actually don't want this button here to be visible until a user starts typing into this input field. And so what I can do today is create a condition on my button that chooses to hide it and only display this button when someone starts typing in the name of a list that they'd like to create. So if I click on my button here, the first thing I'm going to do is open up my layout tab and unselect that this element should be visible on page load, which means that it is going to be hidden. I'm also going to select this option to collapse this element when it is hidden. So that way it's not going to take up any space within this red group. Then finally, I'll jump over to my conditional tab, and I'm going to create a condition that just recognizes when a user has in fact started typing into this input field. So if I define a new condition, I can type in the word input, and I'll reference the input new list, which is the name of that input field. I'll recognize when its value is not empty, meaning someone has started typing in this field. What I'd like to do is select that this element should be visible and tick that that should be true, which means that my button will now be displayed. And after configuring that setting, that wraps up everything I want to cover up to this section in our tutorial. As I said, you can really start to see the overall framework of our board page coming together, but right now nothing is entirely functional. We haven't yet built out the workflow to actually create a new list, and we haven't built out the workflow to be able to drag our lists between each of the columns. But of course, I'll be explaining that within the next steps of our actual tutorial. For now though, I just wanted to jump back into my Notion checklist and tick off that we've started building out the framework of our board page. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this section of our tutorial, I wanted to break the board page into a couple of different modules, just because I don't want to overwhelm you with so much information, because there is a lot involved in bringing this page to life. Moving down through our list of features within my Notion checklist, I once again just want to skip ahead to one of my favorite features within our build today, and that is building out the feature to create and edit lists within an overall Trello board. So these are all of the columns you'll see within a Trello board. And of course, throughout this section of our tutorial, this is where I'm going to explain how we can actually build out the drag and drop functionality. So we're really going to start to see our Trello clone come to life. But now I should just say there is quite a bit involved throughout this process. But of course, it's my job to explain everything you need to know in as much detail as possible. So we're just going to jump ahead and open up our bubble editor. And once we've opened up our board page within our bubble editor, the first thing I'd like to do is build out a workflow that's going to create a new list within our database. So you may remember that we had this little input field on the right-hand side of our list repeating group. And when it comes to this input field, it actually sits inside of a group that has a button directly below it. So if I wanted to display that button, I'd head over to my elements tree, open this up, select to only show hidden elements, and then I can see at the bottom of my elements tree, I have the button add list here. And now that's going to be displayed, and of course I can see that sits inside of my overall red group. Now it's at this point when this button is clicked here that I'd like to create a list. Of course, giving it the name that someone has added into this input field. And then once it's been created, it will be displayed within our repeating group. So what we're going to do is double click on this button here. We're going to open up our property editor. Then I'm going to select to start a workflow every single time this button is clicked. And within this workflow, it's a relatively straightforward process. The first thing I'd like to do is create a new list within my database. So I'm going to head to my data tab and I'm going to choose to create a new thing. The type of thing I'd like to create is of course going to be a list. Then from here, I'll just need to match all of the relevant data fields in my database with all of the relevant inputs on my page. So the first thing is that I'd like to identify the name of this list. Now this of course is going to be the value someone's added into our input field. So if I scroll on down, this is going to be the value of the input new list. I'll select that. Then once this list has been created, I'll also need to link this to a Trello board. So that way I know which list to display within each relevant board. So for the original board, this is going to equal the value of the current page board. So that is the Trello board that someone is currently viewing and has just created a new list within. And then the last field I'll need to change is just the position number of this list. Now the position number will just determine where this list sits on our page. So if I was to open up Trello's real world product here and show you a board of my own, what you'll notice of course is that this is broken down into a series of different columns. Now each of these lists currently has a position number for these columns. So this column number 1 is position number 1, this column number 2 is position number 2, and so on. And so when a new list has been created, we'll obviously want to position that at the end of our Trello board. So let's say we've only got 3 current columns and we create another one. I'd like that to be placed in position number 4, so that would be our column number 4. Now this is an experience we can easily create within Bubble. So if I jump back into my Bubble editor, I'm going to select that for the position number of this new list, I'd like this to equal the total count of how many lists already exist for this board, and then I'd like to add the number 1 to it. So let's say there's already 3 lists, so 3 columns on this Trello board. What I'm going to do is perform a search through my database and count that there is in fact 3 existing lists for this Trello board, and then I'm going to add the number 1 to it, which will just ensure that our new list is positioned right at the end of our board. So for the position number, as I said, I'm going to perform a search in my database for all of the existing lists where the original board that they belong to equals the value of our current page board. Then I'm going to perform a count on how many lists fit that criteria, from which I'm then going to plus to this. So I'm going to select the little plus symbol and I'm going to add the number 1. So now regardless of how many lists exist in this board, any new list that's created will be positioned right at the end of that from the beginning. Now, of course, in a moment, I'm going to show you how we can actually move the positions of our lists around. But before I do that, I'll just need to finish off this workflow here. So after I have created a new list in my database, the last thing I'd like to do is just reset the input field from which someone's adding a name to this list. So I'm just going to add an additional step here. And to be honest, this one is super simple. It's actually the next recommended step. So I'm just going to select to reset the relevant inputs there. Now, because this workflow is related to creating or editing a list, what I'm going to do is actually select on the workflow trigger, and I'm going to color code this in green. So that way later on, if I ever need to find the workflows related to this feature, I can easily identify where they are within my overall workflow editor. And just like that, that is all we'll need to do in order to create a list. The next thing I'd like to do is create some features that will allow us to actually edit the list. So if I jump back into my design tab, you might remember that I have a text field within my overall list. And this text just displays the name of the list itself. But what I'd like to do today is create an experience that allows someone to actually edit this text. So if they ever want to update the name of the list, they should be able to easily do that. And when it comes to this overall experience within our own Trello clone, I'm going to try and replicate the same experience to the real world Trello product. So if I jump over into Trello, what you'll see is that for each list, it obviously displays the text here, which of course includes the name of this list. But it's when I click on this text that it opens up this input field from which I can then make changes to the name of this list. And then when I click away from this list, the text will automatically be saved and the input field will close again. And so the way in which we're going to create this kind of feature today in Bubble is by using an input field below this text element. And we're only going to display either the text or the input field at any given time. So if I was to scroll on down to my input forms here and add in an input field, what we're going to do with this input field is add in some initial content and display the existing name for this list, from which someone can then make changes to that. But before I build out that feature, what I'm going to do is actually update the styling of this input field. So the first thing I'll need to do is just update the name of this. So that way when I create a workflow, I know exactly which input field it's referencing. So I'm going to call this input edit list name, because this is where we're going to edit the name of a list. Then for the initial content, as I mentioned, I'd like this to display the existing name of this list. So I'm going to insert dynamic data and display the parent groups list, its name. It's relatively straightforward. I'm then going to want to make the formatting of this text the exact same as the text element above it there. So I can see that the text has a font size of 18 and it's currently bolded. So I'm going to select on an input field once again. I'm going to remove the style of this. I will update the font size to be 18. I will also bold this. And then from here, I'll jump over into my layout tab because I'd like to make this input field fully responsive. So I'm going to, like always, unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So now this input field will take up as little or as much space as it can within our white group here. I'm then going to update the height of this input field to be 45 pixels. That is purely just a personal preference of mine. It doesn't matter if you leave it at 48. And of course, from here, I'm going to update the margin around this input to have a top border of 10, a bottom margin of 10, as well as a left and a right margin of 10. So that way it's going to replicate the exact same margin around the existing text element above it. And now at this point in time, we've added both our text and our input field. But of course, we're only going to want to display one of these at a time. So by default, when someone lands on this board, what I'd like to do is just display this standard text element here, which is obviously just the existing name of this list. However, when someone clicks on that, I'd like to hide this text element and then display this input field, which of course will then give someone the opportunity to update the name of the list. And then when they click away or select enter within this input field, I'd like to then once again hide this input field and then display the text element. And in order to determine which element we should display at any given time, we're going to leverage what's known as a custom state inside of Bubble. Now, if you're not familiar, custom states in Bubble are a way to temporarily store some data on your page without having to reference anything in your database. So you can kind of think of it like a database on your page. And now, why would you ever want to use a feature like a custom state? As I mentioned, it's a great way to temporarily store some data you might only need for a small amount of time without having to store data in your database and then create a workflow to retrieve that data. So custom states are just a much faster way to temporarily store data that you might only need for a small amount of time. And today I'm going to create a custom state that's just going to tell my Bubble app which one of these two elements should be displayed. So do I either want the actual text element itself to be displayed, or do I want the input field to be displayed? And so in order to create a custom state, I'm going to click on my gray drop area list here. And within your property editor, there's a little hidden menu where you can actually create a custom state. So if we select on this information icon here, it's going to open up this little back door, which is known as our element inspector, from which you'll see this option to create a custom state. Now, if I select on this, what you'll see is that it kind of looks like we're going to be creating a data field within our database. And that's because we essentially are. Only this data field is going to be stored on our page, not within our database. So it just means that we won't have to fill up our database with any unnecessary data that we don't want to store for a long period of time, just because we're going to temporarily store that data on our page. And now when it comes to this custom state, what we'll need to do is give it a name just like we would for a data field. So I'm going to call this edit list title. And when it comes to this state type, I'm going to set this to be a yes/no value because a user's either going to want to actually make changes to the title or they're not going to. So they're going to have the option between both. I'm going to choose to create this. And what I'm also going to do is set the default value of this state to be no, which just means that as soon as the page is loaded, the edit list title custom state will be set to no, which of course just means that someone won't actually want to edit the title of the list yet. They'll only want to whenever they select on this text element itself. And I'm going to show you how we can build out a workflow to update the value of this custom state in a moment. But before I do that, what I'd like to do is create some conditions on both of my elements. So what I'd like to do is just recognize recognize when the value of this edit list title custom state is set to yes. I'm going to want to hide this text element and display this input field, and then also vice versa. When the edit list title custom state is no, I'll want to hide this input field but display my text element. So if I select on my text element here, what I'm going to do is jump over to my conditional tab, and I'm going to define a new condition and just recognize when the custom state stored within my drop area element. So I'm going to type in the word drop. I'll select from the drop area list. And then if I scroll right down to the bottom, you'll be able to reference the custom state that we've just created. So when our edit list title custom state is in fact set to yes, what I'd like to do is select that this element should be visible, and I'm not going to tick that that should be true, which means that this element would then be hidden. And another thing I'll need to change is also within my layout tab. So I can see that by default, this element is visible on page load. Now that's completely fine because I do want this element to be displayed whenever someone loads our page. But one thing I do just want to select is this collapse when hidden option. So when this condition is true and this element is no longer visible, I don't want it to take up any empty space within our white group. So by selecting the collapse when hidden choice, it's just going to hide this element and our input field will move up and take its place. I'm then going to select on our input field here, and I'm going to create a similar condition. Only before I do that, I'm actually going to unselect that this element should be visible on page load, because I don't want this element to be displayed by default. I only want it to be shown when the edit list title custom state has been switched to yes. And of course, it's set as no by default. So whenever the page is loaded, that custom state is set to no, which just means that someone won't want to make changes to the name of this list. It's only when they select on this text here that we're going to update that custom state in a moment, from which I then would like to display this input field. I'm also going to select to collapse this element when it's hidden, so that way it doesn't take up any empty space. I'll jump over into my conditional tab, and I'm going to define a new condition. And once again, I'm just going to search for my drop area list. It's edit list title custom state right down the bottom. And when this state is in fact set to yes, what I'm going to do is select that this element should be visible and now tick that that should be true. And that means that this input field will be displayed and it will move up and take the place of the existing text element above it. And so that is how I can determine which one of these inputs should be displayed at any given time. But the last thing I will need to do is just update how we're storing the value of that custom state within our drop area. So as I mentioned, if I was to select on my drop area element and open up my little information icon, you'll remember that the edit list title custom state is set to no by default. So what I'm going to need to do is create a workflow that's going to set that state to yes whenever this text element is clicked. So I'm going to select on this text element, head over to my appearance tab and choose to start a workflow whenever someone clicks on this. Now within this workflow, this is a pretty straightforward process. All I'd like to do is just update the custom state value we're storing in our drop area list. So I'm going to add in a new workflow step, and I'm just going to type in the word state, and you'll see an option to set the state of an element. The element I'd like to set the state for is of course going to be our drop area list, and the custom state will be our edit list title. And in this case, I'd just like to update the custom state here to equal yes, which means it's going to activate our edit mode. And it will then of course hide our text element and then display our input field. And that's everything I'll need to add into this workflow. Once again, because this workflow is related to either creating or editing a list, what I'm going to do is select on the workflow trigger here and update the event color to be green, so that way I can see it's involved with my list. Now from here, what I'll need to do is recreate a similar workflow that's going to run whenever someone changes the value of this input field here. So let's say our edit list title custom state has been set to yes, and our input field has been displayed. If someone updates the name of this list and then selects enter or clicks away, what I'd like to do is obviously update the name of this list in our database, but then also turn the edit list custom state back to no. So in order to create that, what we'll need to do is jump back into our workflow editor, and we're going to select to create a brand new workflow from scratch. And the trigger from this workflow is going to be within our element events. I'm going to recognize whenever the value of an input field is changed. And that input field is of course our input edit list name. And within this workflow, the first thing I'd like to do is actually just update the name stored for this list in our database. So if we head on down to our data actions, I'm going to select to make changes to an existing thing in our database. The thing I would like to change is going to be the parent groups list. So that is the list that our input field sits within. Then for this list, the field that I'm going to change is just the name. It's relatively straightforward. and I'd just like it to equal the value of this input field. So if someone has updated the name of this list, that will be reflected within this input field, which of course will then be stored in our database here. Then after making this change in our database, the last thing I'll need to do is just switch off our edit mode custom state. So I'm going to add an additional step in this workflow, type in the word state and set the state of an element. The element will once again be our drop area list, and the custom state will be the only one for this element. So it's edit list title. I'm going to then set the value of this to equal no. And because this is a workflow that's related to either creating or editing a list, I'm going to select on the workflow trigger and update the event color here to be green. So that way I can easily tell it apart from the existing workflows on my page. And that is all we'll need to create for this particular feature here. The last thing I want to show you how to do before we take a preview of our Trello board is how we can actually now make our draggable element functional. So once we've created a few lists on our Trello board, I want to be able to potentially rearrange the order of these lists. And of course, I can do that by dragging our white group within our gray drop zone area. And now this is where things can get a little bit more complex, but of course, I'm going to try and explain everything I can in as much detail as possible. But the way this is going to work is that I'm going to once again create another custom state on my page. So you may remember for our overall lists within our database, we have the data field in our list, which is the position number of that list. So that obviously just determines where it's going to be positioned in our overall Trello board. And what I'd like to do is when I swap two lists around, I just want to update the position number. So I'm basically just going to want to swap around the position number of the two lists that I'm rearranging. And perhaps the best way to illustrate this is just by opening up the real world Trello product here. So let's say within our columns, so all of our lists here, we've got list in position number 1 and we've got a list in position number 2. Now let's say I want to move this list in position number 1 over to the list in position number 2. What I'd like to do on the back end of my application, so within our workflow, I'm going to somehow need to store the value of the list that I'm currently wanting to move. So the list in position number 1. And I'm also going to need to store the value of the list that I would like to swap it with. So the position number 2. Then once I drop a list down in our drop zone, I'd like to make changes in our database for both of these lists, in which case I'd like to swap their position numbers around. So this list would then be position number 2, and this one would then be position number 1. And the way I can temporarily store the values of which lists I'm wanting to swap is of course by using another custom state. So if I jump back into our bubble editor and open up our design tab, what I'd like to do is select on our overall repeating group that displays all of our lists. Now, if you've been following along with me and color coding our elements, our repeating group is this yellow element that our overall drop area and our list sits within. And of course, this repeating group is searching for a series of lists in our database. And so when it comes to this repeating group, what I'd like to do is create a way to store the value of the list that's being selected and also the list that's going to be swapped around. So I'm going to create two custom states here. So if I open up my information icon for this repeating group, I'm going to create a new custom state. And for the name of our first custom state, I'm going to call this position number. And then in brackets, I'm going to type in the word selected. And so whenever someone selects on a list that they want to drag, I'm going to store the position number of that current list. So for this state type, I just like this to be a number. I'm going to choose to create this. And I won't need to set a default value just because we're going to be setting the value of this whenever someone actually selects on a list. I'm then going to create an additional custom state and I'm going to call this position number and then in brackets dropped. And so this is going to be able to store the position number of the element that's going to be swapped around in our workflow. And once again, this state type is just going to be a number. I'll create that. And once again, I'm also not going to add a default value in that. We'll store that value whenever someone moves a list around. So that's all we'll need to add for our custom states here. So I'm going to close our element inspector there. And now what we'll need to do is create a workflow that's going to recognize whenever someone picks up a list and drops it into another repeating group cell. And so we'll need to jump back over into our workflow editor and create a brand new workflow from scratch. And if we head on down to our element trigger, what you'll see is that we can reference this trigger here that just recognizes when a drop area has a group dropped on it. So when our drop zone has a list dragged onto it, what I'd like to do is run a workflow. And within this workflow, we're going to need to do a couple of different things. First of all, we're going to need to set values in both of the custom states that we've just created, from which we're then going to store the values from our custom states into our database. so that way we can update the position number of each list. And so within this workflow, the first thing we'll need to do is type in the word state, because we'll want to set the state of an element here. And the element we'll be setting the state of is our repeating group on the page. So our yellow repeating group list. And the first custom state we're going to set is the position number selected. So this is going to be the position number of the list that is being selected and dragged across. And for the value of this state, we're going to set this to be the current cell's list, its position number. So that is the position number of the list that's being selected from our repeating group and will eventually be dropped in another area. And that's all we'll need to update when it comes to our first custom state. From here, we're going to add an additional step into our workflow. Once again, typing in the word state and setting the state of an element. The element will once again be our repeating group list, only this time I'd like to update the position number dropped custom state. So this is just going to recognize the position number of the list that's being swapped out for our new one. So this is where our first list is going to land. And for the value of this custom state, I'd like this to be the position number of the existing list that sits in our drop area. So this is where the first list is going to be dropped. Now, in order to fetch that value, I'm just going to need to make one small change to our workflow trigger. So if I click on our workflow trigger here, I'm just going to give this a type of thing. So almost like a data type. And I'm going to set that thing to be a list. So that way it's going to store the value of the list that's being dropped on, which means if I then select on my custom state that I was just about to change, I can now reference this option known as the current workflows list. So that is the existing list that sits in this drop zone that's being swapped out. So I'm going to select the current workflows list, its position number. And now that we've stored these values in our custom states, we can update these in our database and have our list reflect these new changes. So what I'm going to do is add an additional step into my workflow. I'm going to head to my data tab and I'm going to make changes to a thing. And the first thing I'll need to change is the current cells list. So this is once again the list that's being selected in our first custom state there. I'm going to update the position number of this, and I'm going to change its position number to be the value stored within our dropped area custom state. So I'm going to type in the word repeating group, reference our yellow repeating group list, and from this repeating group, I'm going to reference the position number dropped custom state. So now that's going to swap out the position of the list that's selected with the position number of the list that's being dropped onto. And that's all I'll need to change here. I'll need to add an additional step though, because I'd like to once again make changes to another thing in my database. Only this time I'd like to make changes to the list in our current sales workflow. So that is the list that currently did sit in our drop zone. I want to swap its position number with the list that had been selected. So I'm going to change a field here. I'm going to update the position number, and I'm going to have this equal the value of the custom state stored in our selected state. So I'm going to type in the word repeating group, select from our repeating group list, and I'm going to update it with the position number, the selected element. And that is the last thing I'll need to change here. And that concludes everything I want to add into this workflow as well. Just to keep everything coordinated in my workflow tab though, I'm also going to select on the workflow trigger here, and I'm going to update the event color to be green. So that way I can see this feature is related to either creating or editing a list. And now that actually concludes everything I wanted to add into this particular module. What I'd love to do is just show you a quick preview of how this is going to run in my Bubble application now. And this is where you'll really start to see our overall Trello board come to life. So I'm super excited to show you what we've built. Over in a preview of my Trello board, you can see that I currently have no lists on this board. So I'm going to select my input field here, and I'm going to type in the name of a list I'd like to create. So I'm going to call this the backlog. I'll then select to add this list. What you'll see is that workflow will run. It will create a new list on this board, and then of course reset the value of our input field here. Then I'm going to add another list. I'm going to call this in progress. I'll choose to add this. And once again, that will be added to my board. Then finally, I might make one last list and I'll call this completed. And now you'll see that we have 3 individual columns within our overall Trello board. Now, if I'd like to rearrange the order of these, what I'm going to do is select on our draggable element. So this is our white group, which contains our overall list. And then I'm going to drag this over our drop area. And what you'll see is that the background color of the drop area will slightly change. So that's when you know that it has recognized that this is a drop zone. And if I was to drop drop this list into that, what you'll now see is that these lists will be rearranged. And that's of course because we're updating the values of their position numbers in our database. And you can continually swap these around throughout your whole Trello board. But this is where you can really start to see the whole Trello experience come to life. And so I'm super excited to be making great progress throughout our clone build today. Jumping back into my Notion checklist, I'm going to tick off that we've finished building the feature to not only create a new list within a board, but within that, I've also explained how we could make the elements draggable. So that way we could start rearranging the overall structure of our Trello board. And as I mentioned, it's super exciting to see the progress come to life. It was really only at this point that we could start to see the framework of our Trello clone come into fruition. And at this point, that is all I have time to include within this tutorial. As you can see, we've been building for hours, and yet there's still so many features that I want to cover in as much detail as possible. If you're interested in watching the rest of this course, I'd recommend hitting the link in the description of this video, so that way you can get access to the full course from my own website. And while this full course is going to cost you money, I'm confident that it's going to save you months of time having to learn how to rebuild each of those features from scratch. So I definitely recommend checking it out if you want to launch your app as quickly as possible. Throughout that full course, it's going to explain how we can build all of the remaining features within my overall list today. And so at this point, we're still yet to build out the feature that allows someone to create a task within the list, edit the details of that task, and of course, share and invite access to their Trello board with other members inside of our application. I really wasn't lying when I said there's still a whole suite of features we can build to help bring our Trello clone to life. In the meantime though, if you wanted to stay up to date with any additional Bubble resources that I share, I'd recommend hitting that subscribe button on my channel, so that way you can be the first to know whenever I drop a new tutorial. From here though, I just wanted to say a massive thank you for taking the time to watch this tutorial, and I wish you all of the best on your own no-code journey.